Oof! We got it. This is what happens when you mess with the ducky, okay? This is what happens. This is what happens in class. Yay! Come on! Okay, I will be a notch higher. Okay, right off the bat, what is this? What is this Holodomor Genocide question? Can we go to the real Wikipedia page for a second here? It doesn't say what? It's not a question. What the hell? It's not a question. Right off the bat, this honesty to the nth degree. What is this BS about it being a question? It's not a question. Wait. Isn't Empanada super anti-Semite? Oh yeah! I heard that Empanada has a nasty habit of going after Jewish people. And I'm Jewish. I'm Polish Jewish. And also trans. So I might incur the wrath of Empanada. What the? This is so messed up. You need to remember Dahaka. Technically speaking, any Jewish person, documented Jewish person, can be Israeli national. But that's besides the point. Okay, let's listen to what he has to say. But right off the bat, this honesty strikes because there is no such thing as the Holodomor Genocide question, quote unquote. There's just the Holodomor. Although I know it under the name of the Great Hunger in Ukraine, and that's because when you go to the Wikipedia, right? In Polish Wikipedia, it's called in Polish wiki, it is called Wielki Głód na Ukrainie, which translates into the Great Hunger of Ukraine. So Polish people know it as the Great Hunger, and I am pretty sure that Ukrainian people themselves also call it the Great Hunger. You know? I actually know personally people that Ukrainian people still very much remember the Great Hunger. Okay? So it's really insulting to claim that it is false. It's really insulting and disgusting.
In doing so, I'll talk about Wikipedia's problems, which will hopefully inspire viewers to look at it a bit more critically. Something that I think is important because many of us use it constantly, myself included. We'll also be going over the historical research on the Holodomor and the 1932 to 1933 Soviet famine in detail, and especially the question of whether or not the famine was intentionally planned and engineered to genocide Ukrainians. A pretty commonly held belief that you might have heard of before, and something that I've wanted to address here on my channel for a while now. Now let's get right down to it.
This dishonest piece of crap.
Wikipedia is, according to its official tagline, the free encyclopedia.
Wait, where is Empanada from? Who is he? Can we do a little bit of research on him? Does he have a Wikipedia or something? Where is he from? Who is he? Do you know anything about him? Do we know anything about him apart from the fact that he's Argentina? Vitubia. Is this him? Yeah, that's right. That's him. Where is he from? Australian. He's from Australia. He's from Australia. Living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Okay.
Yeah, that anyone can edit. In theory, that's a great idea. An attempt to try and aggregate the sum of human knowledge in a very collaborative and inclusive way. And it does usually work okay. It's reasonable
it
at giving
works.
an introductory outline on many topics, especially one.
It works okay. It works okay when the info on Wikipedia agrees with him. But when it doesn't, then it doesn't work okay anymore. You know what? We're gonna look up some sources.
Ones that aren't particularly controversial. And
okay, since I don't have real in-depth knowledge about the Great Hunger, can we do this? We're gonna respond to this video, okay? We're gonna look into some sources on the fly, and then I'm gonna create a more in-depth thing, after this stream. What do you think about that? Because there are many Polish sources. I might look into really, sources that are not Western, so to speak. So I will have to do that. But for now, we are going to look for some internet sources on the fly as well in Polish. I'm gonna look them up. We're gonna have some fun with this. I'm gonna have to edit this heavily for a segment, but we're gonna have fun doing this, okay? The server you're reacting to. Oh, okay. Do you mean the Google card? You should tag people. You should tag people and ask them to come. You should tag any person that is online and will be interested in the critique of Empanada. In fact, let's we're gonna write a tweet about this. How about that? So we are in hell and we are discussing Empanada, the Great Hunger, which definitely happened. It's like, ever since I was a child, I always felt it was so ridiculous that it was really famous that people in the US would say that things like the Holocaust did not happen, when it was so obvious for everyone here that it did happen. Same with things like the Great Hunger. Everybody knows that it did happen, and it was the effect of a failed, horribly rushed, horribly planned plan by Stalin, the 5-year plan. Like, everybody knows that the 5-year plan is directly responsible for the Great Hunger, The plan that was unachievable. Stalin actually made unachievable plans and rushed them and forced them and caused tons of people to die because of it. Everybody knows this. I guess, apart from da. Let's go.
And it's mostly reliable if you just want to look up some basic facts. Things like what is a dog? Or what is a snake?
What?
Or who was the president?
That's not true. That's not true, but Empanada. Like, Wikipedia has many, many good sources. Like, hello, Queen. Like, I have checked many things on Wikipedia that I actually have a bit more of knowledge, and Wikipedia is usually right on the ball about those things. Like, Wikipedia usually is pretty accurate. So please don't lie about it being like, just for what is a cat, what is a something. Like, that's blatantly not true. That's a lie. That's a total lie. That's BS. Yeah, Wikipedia is pretty good, and it does give you sources which you can click on and check. So stop lying about it being just for some basic things.
Of the USA in 2017. Where things start to get a bit complicated is when we go beyond simple, uncontroversial information and into the whys and hows of an issue. For example, why was Donald Trump the president of the USA in 2017?
When things get complicated is when you don't agree with the conclusions.
An infinitely more complicated and subjective question than just who was the president in 2017. There are many different arguments as to how he got elected, some better or more convincing than others. So in an article that addresses that question, how do we decide which of them are closer to the truth or which to include?
We look into the sources, genius.
Wikipedia's attempt to tackle this problem is its stated policy of neutrality. The idea is that when venturing beyond the realm of simple, uncontroversial fact,
people put links to sources. Do you know how you can check the claims? You read the sources linked into Wikipedia and you check how good the sources are. Okay? This is how you check it. But Empanada is a real lunatic from what I know. Obsessive person that harasses and just stalks people. You know? He had 2 good videos on Columbus. That's the only positive thing you can say about him. Yeah.
The article should mostly try to avoid forming its own conclusions. Rather, it should try to present the arguments and counter-arguments of both sides.
Also, I'm just gonna say this. The Great Hunger in Ukraine is not some contested topic. It's a topic that's common. It's a fact. The Great Hunger in Ukraine is not a contested topic that you have 2 sides on. 2 of them are equally good. It's up to interpretation. Nope, sorry, it's not. It's not a contested topic. Only deluded Marxists-Leninists claim that the Great Hunger either didn't happen or was not done on purpose. Only Marxist-Leninists do this. Just like it's not contested, exactly. It is not contested at all. Only Marxist-Leninists contest things like that. Interestingly enough, my dad just said you should take a neutral stance and teach both sides of a genocide. Yeah, he did! That's because he treats the topic of the Great Hunger in the same way as the topic of why Trump was elected, which is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. And funny enough, just as Marxist-Leninists say that the Great Hunger either didn't happen or was not done intentionally, the Nazis will deny the Holocaust happened, or they will say far less people have died. Interesting. Those groups are very similar like that, you know? They have similar beliefs.
And allow the reader to make their own assessment. In practice, however, it rarely actually works out that way, because Wikipedia is a product of both its rules and the opinions and agendas of its editors, moderators, and administrators. Its rules must be based on reliable sources,
talk about
and
the
these
West?
reliable sources must be published by a
Okay, let's listen
party.
some more.
That alone already injects a ton of bias into the encyclopedia, as what's considered reliable and reputable in the first place is not only subjective, but can be very prone to manipulation. News outlets of record are considered shoo-ins as reputable, reliable sources on Wikipedia. It's incredibly common for entire articles to be based on their conclusions alone, which are taken as simple proven fact by virtue of the fact that they said so. Yet that these outlets have a particular editorial line they tend to adhere to that dictates what they choose to report on in the first place, how they report on it, and even the purported facts that they present is given little to no consideration. Nor is the fact that said editorial line also always happens to conform with the interests of their impossibly rich owners. These media organizations...
Because it's like, I know if Empanada said we should teach both sides. He's reading the Wikipedia guy, typical. Yeah, but there is no two sides to the Great Hunger, or there is no two sides that we should talk about when it comes to the Holocaust, okay? That there are no two sides to certain things. There are no sides to is the earth flat or not. There shouldn't be two separate articles on the Wikipedia, one that says that earth is flat, one that says that earth is not flat, okay? That is not how it should work. That's one. And two, yeah, it's really interest of the rich media to claim that the Great Hunger happened. Oh yeah. I bet the great corporations are really invested in claiming that the Great Hunger happened, especially now. The benefit is like immeasurable. So much profit from that, right? Like, what is this ridiculous claim? This is ridiculous.
Control over the flow of supposedly reputable information
course.
are also able to leverage this control to turn themselves into the arbiters of what's even considered
Oh yeah, it's about control. The Great Hunger is about control.
Wikipedia too. When the community comes together to decide on whether a source is reliable or not, the simple fact that other so-called reliable sources consider it reliable themselves is given huge weight. Such as in this discussion about the reliability of an Australian military think tank, which was nearly voted as being reliable just on the basis that other Western media outlets like to cite it. So it's a self-perpetuating circle of bias. Wikipedia rarely assesses individual sources on their own merit. Rather, they are far more often accepted or rejected.
If it makes communism look bad. Let's make it clear, okay? On this stream, we do not consider Marxism-Leninism to be communism, okay? As I've said before, and I will say it again, I will provide sources, I will provide evidence, don't worry. Communists defied and fought against the Marxist-Leninism government in Poland. I will give heavy examples from the Polish history because I have a lot of things to rely on here, a lot of real documents, not second-hand sources. I have original sources. I have original documents, original sources at home that I have to look through. I have to segregate them, and I need to prepare them, but I do have original sources. I do have access to original sources, so not second-hand sources. So that will be interesting.
Based purely on the perceived reputability of their host publication.
Marxism-Leninism is not communism.
Essentially just giving the editors of these so-called reputable outlets editorial control over Wikipedia itself.
Okay, this is like
matters worse, on Wikipedia, the ultimate decision on the reliability and reputability of a source is made via community votes. And the people who comprise said community come from societies where the hegemonic media also happens to dictate public opinion. So of course their vote is just going to reaffirm exactly.
Okay. We will do another interesting thing. We'll be comparing Polish Wikipedia to the English Wikipedia while we're at it. Since this person does not trust the Western Wikipedia so much, thank God I can read Polish, and thank God we can just compare directly the English Wikipedia to the Polish one. Poland is not a Western country. Poland is not part of the hegemon by any means, okay? There we go. Poland is definitely not part of the hegemon. Poland is definitely not a part of the imperial court, quote unquote, and it used to be a Marxist-Leninist country itself. So there we go. There we go. So we're gonna take this into account as well.
So Wikipedia's...
I'm gonna be interested if there are many significant differences between the Polish Wikipedia and the English one. We're gonna do some comparisons. We're gonna only compare the parts that he is looking at and analyzing, okay? at least for now.
Baseline has a strong tendency to reflect an amalgamation of the editorial lines of the mainstream Western sources that the community has
Western
in a very
sources.
inevitable, self-fulfilling way, accepted as
Does Empanada imply that he has sources that are not Western?
reliable. That doesn't mean that it's always or even mostly wrong, just that the articles can be, and often are, directed more towards spreading certain political narratives than the truth. It's not just that the sources themselves are biased,
Unlike Empanada, he does not try to spread any sort of political thing at all.
They're always going to manifest in some way. This means that the biases of members of its community are aggregated into a final product.
You're not trying to spread anything.
Rather than being neutral, tends to at the very least.
Yeah, but you're so neutral, Mr. Marxist-Leninist.
And the biases of these community members,
you have no bias at all.
English speakers from Western countries, are also
so biasless.
By the societies in which they live and the flow of information within them, for all the reasons that I just went over.
Yeah, okay.
This has manifested itself most clearly in the community consensus to heavily limit the citation of non-Western state-backed media outlets. In contrast, US state media outlets, which are at the very least just as unreliable.
I wanna see what are the sources for the Polish Wikipedia. I want to see if there are Polish sources or if there are Western sources, for one. Let me see. There are some Western sources. Oh, what do you know? Oh. Wait, hold on. This is not a Western source. Hold on. What's going on here? I'm not sure if you see, but this doesn't look very Western. Let's see some other sources. Let me see. Oh, wait, hold on. Well, do you know? What do you know? It says here, Poland knew perfectly well what was going on, and Warsaw received many reports of the happenings in the Soviet Union on a regular basis. Not a Western source. Not a Western source. Poland is definitely not part of the West. Poland cries about the West all the time. Poland thinks the word gender is a Western invention. Like, Polish people used to be considered by Western Europe to be Asian people.
To be reliable sources, despite the fact they frequently make extraordinary and completely unverifiable claims about the USA's geopolitical rivals without any evidence beyond someone we spoke to who we swear.
It's not all about the US, dude.
It definitely exists, told us this, trust us, stories which are then, of course, never corroborated by any other source ever. For comparison, Wikipedia's editors near unanimously voted to ban the Global Times, a Chinese state media outlet, from being cited.
We're not kidding! Chinese state media? Are you kidding?
Information, conspiracy theories, and propaganda promoting the Chinese government.
Are you?
I actually agree with that assessment completely, but every single one of those reasons also applies equally to Radio Free Asia. They publish false and fabricated information, including conspiracy theories.
What is Radio Free Asia? State-backed media. Technically speaking. Like, those labels are so arbitrary, Charlie, that is ridiculous. It's really silly how arbitrary those lines are, actually. Wait, where am I? Yeah, I guess I'm gonna...
And propaganda promoting the US government. Yet they're accepted as a reliable source. Literally the complete opposite of Wikipedia's assessment of the...
Again, we have seen already many not Western sources on this topic. So this has been debunked. Actually, let's take a look at the sources in the English wiki. We have seen many non-Western sources in the Polish wiki. Now let's take a look at the English wiki if they're similar. Let's see. Sources in the English wiki. Is there any similar? This is interesting. It does. It actually uses. Polish wiki actually uses the different sources. You know. It actually uses different. But I guess this makes sense, right? That Poland, we would have different sources on the topic than the English Wikipedia, right?
Global Times. That's just one example of how the community's biases often take precedence over Wikipedia's ostensibly espoused rules and guidelines. Since Wikipedia is run by its users and its users as a collective are biased, their consensus reflects that bias. So Wikipedia
Who are you?
inevitably ends up reflecting
like you don't have any better qualifications. You're just a Marxist-Leninist.
Having a pronounced bias in favor of the status quo in Western countries and of
No!
positions are most
What?
convenient for said status quo. For this reason, it's an encyclopedia that, while very useful and undoubtedly an amazing human achievement purely due to its expansiveness, still often directs the reader more towards believing in certain politically charged narratives rather than whatever's actually closest to the truth. This doesn't necessarily mean it always champions the pro-Western position, because sometimes the opposite position is kind of undeniable. Rather that it will, on average, be slanted towards it, often subtly. Hence, why it should always be read very critically and never considered as anything more than just a...
Everything should be read critically. What do you mean? Everything should be read critically. There is no such thing that should not be read critically. Like what? Everything should be read critically. Also, the Great Hunger is not a question. You might as well... How would it sound if you said the Holocaust genocide question, okay? The Nazi genocide question. What would this read? This would be ridiculous. It's not a question.
Enter the Wikipedia page for the Holodomor Genocide question.
There is no...
What is that, you may ask? According to the article itself, this article is about the question of whether the Holodomor constituted a genocide. Convenient. Now, you might not know what the Holodomor is, so let's consult...
I'm gonna look at this because... There we go. Let's see if this one has a Polish equivalent. What do you know? It doesn't. Do you know why it doesn't? Do you know why the question, if it was real or not, does not have a Polish equivalent or a Wikipedia? Do you know why? Because in Poland, it is not a contested claim. There is no question about it in Poland. Nobody who is considered sane would ever say that this is a question. Nobody. No serious historian would say that it is a question whether or not it was done on purpose. That is why. This is ridiculous to ask. Ridiculous. No, Poland is definitely not part of the West. Poland cries about the West all the time. Poland thinks the word gender is a Western invention. Like, Polish people used to be considered by Western Europe to be Asian people.
To be reliable sources, despite the fact they frequently make extraordinary and completely unverifiable claims about the USA's geopolitical rivals without any evidence beyond someone we spoke to who we swear.
It's not all about the US, dude.
It definitely exists told us this, trust us, stories which are then of course never corroborated by any other source ever. For comparison, Wikipedia's editors near unanimously voted to ban the Global Times, a Chinese state media outlet, from being cited.
We're no kidding! Chinese state media? Are you kidding?
Information, conspiracy theories, and propaganda promoting the Chinese government.
Are you?
I actually agree with that assessment completely, but every single one of those reasons also applies equally to Radio Free Asia. They publish false and fabricated information, including conspiracy theories.
What is Radio Free Asia state-backed media? Technically speaking. Like, those labels are so arbitrary, Charlie, that is ridiculous. It's really silly how arbitrary those lines are, actually. Wait, where am I? Yeah, I guess I'm gonna...
And propaganda promoting the US government. Yet they're accepted as a reliable source. Literally the complete opposite of Wikipedia's assessment of the...
Again, we have seen already many not Western sources on this topic, so this has been debunked. Actually, let's take a look at the sources in the English wiki. We have seen many non-Western sources in the Polish wiki. Now let's take a look at the English wiki if they're similar. Let's see. Sources in the English wiki. Is there any similar? This is interesting. It does... it actually uses... Polish wiki actually uses the different sources. You know? It actually uses different. But I guess this makes sense, right? That Poland, we would have different sources on the topic than the English Wikipedia, right?
Global Times. That's just one example of how the community's biases often take precedence over Wikipedia's ostensibly espoused rules and guidelines. Since Wikipedia is run by its users and its users as a collective are biased, their consensus reflects that bias. So Wikipedia
Who are you?
inevitably ends up reflecting
like you don't have any better qualifications. You're just a Marxist-Leninist.
Having a pronounced bias in favor of the status quo in Western countries and of
no, what?
Convenient for said status quo. For this reason, it's an encyclopedia that, while very useful and undoubtedly an amazing human achievement purely due to its expansiveness, still often directs the reader more towards believing in certain politically charged narratives rather than whatever's actually closest to the truth. This doesn't necessarily mean it always champions the pro-Western position, because sometimes the opposite position is kind of undeniable, rather that it will, on average, be slanted towards it, often subtly. Hence, why it should always be read very critically, and never considered as anything more than just a...
Everything should be read critically, what do you mean? Everything should be read critically! There is no such thing that should not be read critically. Like what? Everything should be read critically. Also, the Great Hunger is not a question. You might as well... How would it sound if you said the Holocaust genocide question, okay? The Nazi genocide question. What would this read? This would be ridiculous. It's not a question.
Enter the Wikipedia page for the Holodomor Genocide question.
There is no...
What is that, you may ask? According to the article itself, this article is about the question of whether the Holodomor constituted a genocide. Convenient. Now, you might not know what the Holodomor is, so let's consult...
I'm gonna look at this because... There we go. Let's see if this one has a Polish equivalent. What do you know? It doesn't. Do you know why it doesn't? Do you know why the question, if it was real or not, does not have a Polish equivalent or a Wikipedia? Do you know why? Because in Poland, it is not a contested claim. There is no question about it in Poland. Nobody who is considered sane would ever say that this is a question. Nobody. No serious historian would say that it is a question whether or not it was done on purpose. That is why. This is ridiculous to ask. Ridiculous. It's like... It's considered to be genocide, yeah. Yeah, because Belarus currently is a puppet state of Russia. Of course it would have of course Belarus would question it. Like, this makes perfect sense to me that Belarus would question it. Like, it's a puppet state of Russia.
On the matter. It states that it was a famine in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933 that killed millions of Ukrainians, and that it was a part of the wider Soviet...
Is bad Empanada pro-Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? I just want to know the answer to this one question. Is pro-Empanada pro or anti-Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Does anyone know? I want to check it out right now. Anything at all?
Famine of 1932 to 1933. That's a decent enough short summary. That's an example of an acceptable citing of Wikipedia. A pretty uncontroversial two-sentence description of something that only total crackpots would deny. Though what immediately follows that part is quite biased. A number of unsourced claims that are clearly directed at pushing the reader towards a certain conclusion, so you always got to be careful and stick to the dry, uncontroversial bits. We're going to be going into much more detail regarding the Holodomor and the
your sources
of 1932 to 33 throughout this video, so I'm going to leave it at that for now to avoid repeating myself. Now, back to the article on the Holodomor Genocide question. At first glance, it seems like a decent, relatively unbiased article that presents all viewpoints equally. Right away in the intro, it plays into this idea of balance by citing one guy who says that the academic consensus is that it was a genocide, then another who says the academic consensus is that it actually wasn't, and then another two sources who say that the issue is actually still hotly debated and that there's not actually any consensus at all. Very confusing, but still, all three stances seem to be given equal prominence, just as you'd expect considering Wikipedia's policy of neutrality. However,
interesting enough, it only seems to be a debate among Marxist-Leninists in the West and in Russia and its satellite countries. Interesting that, huh? He claims about Western biased sources, and yet only Western Marxists, Leninists seem to question it. Like,
things get very iffy from there. The intro then goes on to cite the fact that 15 countries recognize the Holodomor as genocide. I don't know why this is even included here. The stances of governments on matters like these have far more to do with whatever's most politically convenient for them than with them honestly assessing the historical evidence. So they're not exactly reliable sources.
What are you talking about?
A particularly illustrative example
I will have to.
In 2003 and 2008, the Australian Parliament formally passed a resolution recognizing the Holodomor as genocide. Yet it's also never actually formally acknowledged its own genocide of Aboriginal people, which there is an overwhelming scholarly consensus supporting.
What? This is a...
Australia even rejected the results of a report which
This is what aboutism, okay?
which also came to the same conclusion, that the Australian state was guilty of genocide. In fact,
what does that have to do with anything?
Integrate the crime of genocide into Australian law until 2002, specifically to ensure that the state couldn't be taken to court for its genocide of Indigenous people.
What does it have to do with...
The reason that they finally implemented
What does it have to do with anything, first of all? And second of all, Poland received reports about what was happening in the USSR on the regular before World War II, okay? On the regular. Poland was the neighbor of the USSR. We knew what was happening. There are multiple reports about the genocide that were coming to Warsaw. That is why in Poland it is not a question. What is this whataboutism about Australia? This has nothing to do with the topic. This is nothing. I don't care. If Australia committed atrocities as well, then it should answer for those atrocities as well. This is like whatever. Like, we can talk about Australia's wrongs as well. I don't have a problem with that. I can talk about Poland's wrongs as well. This is ridiculous.
It was to ensure that the International Criminal
What
Court
does this-
could not try Australians for the crime, and they made sure to include a provision that the law was not retroactive, all because they knew that otherwise they would be prosecuted for their genocide of Indigenous people. So whether something is a genocide is not decided by
Also, I do have to. Yeah, ban empanada. I have to point something out because this is a bit dishonest, okay? I don't know how it works in the West. I don't know how law works in the West. But the rule that new law does not work in retrospective is a basic rule of law. Okay? It's one of the basic rules of law that if you implement new laws, they do not work in retrospect. Okay? This is one of the very super basics of law, at least in Poland. Okay? In Poland, when you have done a thing, when you have been doing a thing till now, and then they implement a law that, for example, makes it a crime, then they cannot arrest you just because you have been doing that thing in the past. That would make no sense. Okay? Laws do not work in retrospect. Yes.
parliamentary vote
It's part
or
of law.
executive order from any
It's like
number
one
of
of the very
governments,
basic
but
things
rather
about
by an
law.
exhaustive assessment of the evidence on the matter. And none of these recognitions were based on anything resembling such an assessment. They happened for purely political reasons, including what historian Olga Andruski called a vigorous international campaign initiated by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to have the United Nations.
Like, just imagine if one day your country would implement a whole new tax, 50% tax on product X, and then you would go to jail because for the last 5 years you have not been paying tax X for the product. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it, if they would just apply the new law in retrospect? Oh, we just introduced this new tax that you have not been paying for the last 5 years. What have you got to say for yourself? Ridiculous.
The Council of Europe and other governments recognized the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33 as a deliberate act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. So these are clearly politically motivated recognitions, and they're wholly irrelevant to the question that the article poses, yet are included anyway because they help to instill in the reader the conclusion that the Wikipedia community would like to push. And it gets worse in the main subject of this video, which is
Oh my
the
God.
actual body of the article, which presents opinions from both sides of the argument in more detail. What I'm going to be showing here is that
I'm gonna see if this is really a question in the because there is a genocide thing in the Polish one. Russia doesn't believe that it was genocide. Oh wow. Oh my, I really care about what Russia has to say. You want to assist me? How should we do it? Yeah, of course he's being dishonest. I know. I have the Polish sources here. There is no question about this in Poland. Like in Poland, this is fact. In Poland, this is treated as fact. Okay? It's not treated. Okay, well, let's look for an article, okay? Let's look at this first of all. We're gonna take a little bit of an improv dive into it, okay? We're gonna look for some stuff and then we're gonna take a deeper dive and maybe prepare a video. So thank you very much for this source, Charlie. We'll look at it right now. A letter from the Secretary of Kharkiv Oblast Committee to the Bolsheviks, Komsomol members and pioneers of Kharkiv Oblast with a call to make the efforts for the fulfillment of the Oblast of the main thing, grain procurement plan for the state until the 1st November, completion of autumn sowing until. Yeah, basically, even if when there was, this is an important thing to add, even when there was food, it was locked away from the citizens of Ukraine. It was taken away. All the food that they did have was taken away and guarded by soldiers. This is important. I will look for a source myself. Let me see. This is really, really important. Gosh. We'll switch to Polish language and Yeah, that's right, original language. We are playing Doom and we are discussing Empanada Bada Baba, a very, very dishonest actor. They blacklisted hundreds of villages, most Ukrainian refused to let them. They kept storages of food under guard while people died. That is the truth of the matter. Yeah, that's right. This is really interesting because the Great Hunger happened in the 30s, okay? And this Polish source tells us about a second Great Hunger in Ukraine in 1946, 1947, when people in Ukraine were dying from hunger and Stalin sent food to Poland from Ukraine, okay? This is another thing that we will look at in the future, but right now I want to concentrate on the hunger from the 30s. Yeah, the one from the 40s is apparently much less documented. Interesting. But we're not gonna talk about that one today. We're gonna talk about the one from the 30s today. Wielki Głód na Ukrainie. Holodomor pochłonął życie milion ofiar. Sztuczna. I will translate this on the fly. And for bad Empanada, if he decides to listen to this small video of a very small streamer, this is not a Western source. This is not a Imperial Court source. This is a Polish source, okay? A Polish source. Sztuczna klęska wywołana z premedytacją przez centralu partii komunistycznej w Moskwie doprowadziła do depopulacji Ukraińskiej Socjalistycznej Republiki Radzieckiej. So, artificially created famine that was done on purpose by the Central Committee of the USSR caused the death of, it is estimated, from 4 to 8 million people. Okay? It is just not contested in places like Ukraine or Poland. There is no such thing as the Holodomor Genocide question. Let's look at your sword some more, Charlie. Okay. Very nice. Thank you very much for this source. Today we're not taking such a super deep dive into the Great Hunger, but we will definitely look through this video and then we will prepare a much
Wikipedia editors collectively, whether they actually consciously intended to do so or not, scrape the bottom of the barrel to bolster the case for the famine as genocide position over the not genocide one. Anyone can edit Wikipedia, so it might have changed by the time you're watching this, but as of March and April 2022, this is still the case. They present much lower quality claims on the matter that sometimes aren't even backed up or argued for at all, as if they were equal to the latest historical scholarship, specifically dealing with this exact question in detail, which mostly concludes that the famine was actually not a genocide. And they sometimes even broke Wikipedia's rules and guidelines in the process of doing so. This is quite an old and well-refined Wikipedia article. It's gone through a ton of revisions and a lot of community discussion around improving it. Yet it still ended up in this state. And
I want to see what sources he's got for that claim, okay?
By the Wikipedia community,
because,
which certainly backs up what I
as I've said in Poland, this is not contested.
This type of subtle manipulation is very common throughout Wikipedia, and really to how public opinion is dictated in general, beyond Wikipedia. It's not that some shady cabal of Wikipedia editors have gotten together to lie to you about the Holodomor, though weird things like that do sometimes happen on Wikipedia. Rather, these editors and their habits merely reflect.
It wasn't. I'm gonna make a stronger statement than that, Charlie. It wasn't some people that were discriminated against, okay? There were whole villages that were starved out by soldiers who were guarding food. It's a thing that you learn about at school. This is ridiculous.
Reflect the wider forces that dictate public opinion in their societies. So in a case like this one, where the consensus among historians actually specialize in this topic, which Wikipedia articles about history are meant to be based on, doesn't fit with what most editors would like to be true, they will often collectively manipulate the article to make it as favorable to their preferred version of the truth as they can.
Unlike you, okay.
This can be difficult to spot
You're
if you're not
unbiased.
reading very carefully or aren't already well versed in the topic. It's an
like
excellent
you.
example of why you should be very, very critical.
This is why you should be a Marxist-Leninist. If you're a Marxist-Leninist, then you're very well versed, and then you will know that it's actually not a genocide, and actually Russia is the best country in the world. If only you were a Marxist-Leninist. Yeah, of course. Isn't it interesting that it's only a question among Western Marxist-Leninists and in places like Russia?
when reading Wikipedia on anything that's even remotely politically contested, and ensure that you don't let it dictate your own beliefs, or just actually don't read it at all in those cases. That's really ideal. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to present one of the sources that the Wikipedia article cites to support the pro-genocide side, and by pro-genocide I mean they think it was a genocide, not that they actually are pro-genocide literally, okay?
What?
And then do the same with one of its sources from the not-genocide camp. And we'll keep going until there's none left. Then I'll form a conclusion and give my own hot takes on the matter. It's going to be very, very juicy, so make sure you watch until the end.
It's not a hot take. I know what your opinion is.
Source from the feminist genocide section.
Oh, blacklisted villages. It's not really a hot take if you're so predictable, bad empanada. Don't call it. Do you know what would be a hot take from you if you agreed that it was a genocide? I would treat that as a hot take from you, okay?
It cites an article by Simon Payaslian, a historian specialized in Armenian history, called 20th Century Genocides, published on the Oxford Bibliography's online website. The part of the page which the wiki article cites is this sentence. A consensus has formed among scholars that genocides in the 20th century encompassed, although were not limited to, the following cases: the Herero genocide, the Armenian genocide, the Holodomor in the former Soviet Ukraine, the Jewish Holocaust, Bangladesh in 1971, Cambodia in 1975 to 1979, East Timor in 1975 to 1999, Bosnia in 1991 to 1995, and Rwanda in 1994. In the work itself, this passage provides no citation for this, and this is the only time in the entire article where the author even mentions the Holodomor. I also checked out his other works, and he's never actually written about it specifically. Aside from in this article, he's only ever mentioned it once in passing, in an article that was actually about the Armenian genocide. So he's never actually directly addressed the question of whether and why the Holodomor was a genocide himself, nor has he written anything about the purported scholarly consensus on the matter that he mentions here. Funnily enough, he's pretty much only ever actually mentioned in relation to the Holodomor in references to this very Wikipedia article, which for some reason chose to cite him as its first source. Oxford Bibliographies Online is an actual peer-reviewed source, and the historian being cited is an actual historian, though he's clearly not one who has much expertise relevant to this topic and question specifically. Content-wise, however, this source is just totally inadequate, and has nothing going for it that is at all really relevant to the Holodomor genocide question, aside from the guy basically saying, yep, it was a genocide, and not explaining anything. Just kind of mentioning it in passing. So the very first source presented here is one that doesn't actually directly address the question at hand at all. It rather just makes an unsourced statement, which is then cited in the Wikipedia article. This goes against Wikipedia's own guidelines on reliable sourcing, which state that information in an article must be verifiable in the references cited. In general, article statements should not rely on unclear or inconsistent passages or on passing comments. The citing of Payaslian here is both unverifiable, as his article provides no source for the claim, and it relies on citing a passing comment. The Holodomor just mentioned one time among a bunch of other events, with nothing specific said about it at all. So why is it in the article anyway then? Because the consensus making
this is of course not a question in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Great Hunger is considered a genocide as well, of course.
Mechanisms of Wikipedia.
Well, because he's a dishonest hack.
Those involved are very willing to stretch the bounds of what's acceptable to include if it suits their preferred conclusion. This article has gone through countless revisions and audits, and many sources have been...
This is fluff, there's nothing in here so far.
...by community consensus,
Okay.
most of which were against the genocide conclusion. Yet this one still remains.
Can I see a non-Western source from you?
Someone who is still at least a real scholar, in a real peer-reviewed source, helps with all of this. It lends it this superficial aura of authority that the actual substance of the source itself and the...
You're not saying anything.
...fails to back up, which is easy to get away with in a Wikipedia article because very few readers will actually check the sources. And even if someone did check the source and then also decided to put in the time and effort to challenge its inclusion in this article, there's very little chance that they could come out on top against the biases of this community that made this article what it is.
They're not Marxist-Leninists.
So let's move on to the sources presented that conclude that the Holodomor was not a genocide. The first thing that pops out for me here is that while the Payaslian article is cited both in the Wikipedia page's intro paragraph and used to spearhead the famine as genocide section, the following article that was cited in the aforementioned intro that states the exact opposite, that
I think the reason so many people like Empanada are so hesitate to decry the Holodomor as genocide because it would be give an olive branch to anti-communists. No, it is. I think people that like bad Empanada are just like fanatical Marxist-Leninists. Like I'm on a very aggressive anti-Marxist-Leninist arc, you know. Like this is like really bad.
The consensus is that it was not actually a genocide, isn't actually included in the body of the article.
Okay,
what's this article by historian J. Arch Getty is at least of equal quality as a source as Payaslian's article is, and that's being very generous to the latter. Getty is a specialist on the Soviet Union who has specifically...
Oh, a Western source! Born in Louisiana. Oh, so this Western source is okay when it agrees with you. Okay, but Empanada, I agree. Okay, I see. A good Western source is when the source agrees with you. Okay, I see. I'm gonna check this. J. Arc Getty. We're checking this guy because this is... There we go. English. Interesting. If he agrees that Holodomor has happened because of bad policies, then he basically agrees that it's a genocide. I'm sorry. I see. Okay. It makes sense. If he agrees that it's like a bad policy, then yeah, it's a genocide. The bad policy caused the genocide, yeah. Because the bad policy was done on purpose. It was done on purpose knowing that it would cause so much damage, yeah. That's the part about it that makes it the genocide. The fact that they pushed the bad policy knowing how much harm it would cause. That was the whole point. That is the whole point. Okay. So in reality, the source that is anti-genocide is not really anti-genocide. It's just a matter of semantics, I see.
Albeit in a limited capacity, written peer-reviewed work on the Holodomor specifically that directly addresses the question of whether or not it was a genocide. He's also engaged in the public debate surrounding this since the 80s. It makes no sense for Payaslian, who's never actually talked about the topic, beyond just a couple of fleeting mentions, to be cited both in the intro and the body, yet for Getty not to be. Unless, of course, the article was trying to lead the reader towards a certain conclusion. Anyway, so the first source that they do include in the famine as crime but not genocide section is an article by the economic historian Michael Ellman.
If it was supposed to still be genocide, when they saw the harm, they could have shifted policy or continued to allow Ukrainians to be systematically eliminated. They chose the latter. That's genocide. Yeah. That's because they knew the damage that it would cause, and Stalin basically pushed for the policies. That's right.
A specialist in the Soviet economy. Ellman's article, written in 2007, is 31 pages long and specifically deals with the question of whether the famine was genocide or not, directly addressing the relevant scholarship. This is a quality, modern scholarly analysis that's very much worthy of being included here. To sum up his stance, he says that the famine was caused by Stalin and his government's policy of forced collectivization of agriculture, which they were genuinely optimistic about when planning and initiating, yet which was disastrous in practice. Since the most common definition...
Yeah, but there's this one problem. I will have to look into the sources about this, Queen Charlie. You can back me up on this, but Stalin, the problem with those policies and how they were implemented, among others, was that Stalin was not an expert on any of it, and he pushed his will on the policies anyway. He dictated the policies without knowing what it would cause, but he did it anyway because he wanted things to be done his way. Okay? That is one of the biggest problems. And also, Empanada literally doesn't get to read Wikipedia source. Like all the shit he said about source 2. Source 2 is cited only as the source for the correct pronunciation and spelling of Holodomor in Ukrainian. Okay, I see. So this is a dishonest framing. Once again from a dishonest man. But yeah, the problem with the thing about saying that it's just bad policy is that it was bad policy dictated by a lunatic. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, Queen Charlie, but the thing that led to the Great Hunger was Stalin's 5-year plan, wasn't it? It was part of the 5-year plan, wasn't it? The crazy, insane plan that had zero chance of actually succeeding. Yeah. Basically, I remember a bit about those things. So we will have to go and dig into it in depth, but
definition of genocide, using the UN definition, requires specific intent. He agrees with some other authors that bad policy that didn't turn out the way those implementing it had hoped cannot be considered genocidal by this common definition. He goes on to state that while by his assessment, Stalin's actions once the famine was underway, such as instituting a policy to turn back starving peasants fleeing the affected areas, do constitute crimes against humanity, there is nonetheless just not any evidence fitting of the UN definition of genocide for the same reason that we just went over.
This is so dishonest. Like, this is horribly dishonest. Like, Bad Empanada basically saying, yeah, they did turn the starving people away. It was horrible crime against humanity. But you know what? According to a definition, technically speaking, it's not a genocide, even though it was a policy that led to the death of millions. Starving people were turned away. It was a crime against humanity, but technically speaking, we cannot call it genocide because the UN definition does not agree. Does that sound honest to you? Does that sound honest, like honest representation to you? Or does that sound to you like an example of Marxist, Leninist, dishonest hackery? Can we have a poll on this? Because this is really annoying me. Is Bad Empanada really going to argue on semantics? Not on whether or not a crime was committed, which is the more important topic? I don't really care if it's called a genocide or not. What I care about is whether or not a crime was committed against millions of people. This is what I care about, but apparently it's not what Bad Empanada cares about. He doesn't give a crap if a crime was committed against millions. He just cares about using a word. Like, this tells me a lot. You know? Like, this tells me a lot. It's okay. Poll. I'm gonna do a poll. Is Bad Empanada Lada a dishonest act that wants to insist that the great Ukrainian deny genocide on technicality. Yes, no, start poll. Ban Empanada, dishonest hack that wants to deny genocide on technicality. Yes or no? There we go. Okay, answer. Also, we're gonna have Queen Charlie for a bit here to tell us. Hello, hello.
Hello, dear. How are you doing?
Okay, so first of all, if you could introduce yourself to us, to everybody, who you are, what your connection with history is, and then if you could give us your take on the great hunger in Ukraine.
My name is Charlie. My stage name. I am a historian in training. I, in particularly, specialize in American history, but I also do deep dives in the Soviet history. And my interest in history is motivated simply by a desire to know the truth, and use history as sort of like a guide or like a means of helping people in a way
Okay,
by challenging the structures of power.
right. So, can you tell us about what you have learned about the Great Hunger during your studies? What maybe sources you have depended on? What books you have read? What is your take on the thing?
Oh boy,
That's a big
I have a
topic.
lot of them, but I don't know where to start. But basically, my take on the Holodomor is that yeah,
Yeah,
I
go on.
feel like the Holodomor is that it. I feel like it happened. I'm of the position that the Holodomor was, I guess to quote a friend, the famine
Yeah,
was incidental, but the starvation was intentional.
yep, definitely.
So
Yeah.
what I mean by that is the Holodomor was definitely a genocide, but initially it didn't start out with that in mind until circumstances emerged which allowed it to happen.
Can you tell us about the circumstances and what exactly led to it from what you have learned?
Oh boy, that's a
That's a big
I have a
topic.
lot of them, but I don't know where to start, but basically my take on the Holodomor is that yeah,
Yeah,
I
go
feel
on.
like the Holodomor is that it I feel like it happened. I'm of the position that the Holodomor was, I guess to quote a friend, the famine
Yeah,
was incidental, but the starvation was intentional.
yep, definitely.
So
Yeah.
what I mean by that is the Holodomor was definitely a genocide, but initially it didn't start out with that in mind until circumstances emerged which allowed it to happen.
Can you tell us about the circumstances and what exactly led to it from what you have learned? Are you here?
So the so the circumstances behind it was that um as I assume that you know and a lot of people would probably know is that Stalin wanted to implement his 5-year plans
Yeah,
to
that's
rapidly
right.
industrialize the Soviet Union, but in order to do that he needed to get as much grain as possible to help feed the growing industrial workforce and to also sell excess grain off to Western countries to get access to the machinery necessary to industrialize. And when those collectivization policies inevitably failed, Stalin needed a sort of like a scapegoat. So he turned towards the Ukrainian peasants who resisted collectivization, and he and his bureau labeled them as kulaks, like wealthy peasants,
Right,
which really was just a colloquial term for just like any peasant that fought against collectivization.
that's right.
And
You're
but if you look at Soviet records, you actually feel that like a lot of it was like they cited justifications of like targeting the Ukrainian bourgeoisie and Ukrainian nationalists. Depending
source.
on
Yeah,
depending on like who you are, you can either interpret that as the elimination of a political class, which doesn't align with that definition.
yeah. And of course, it's important to remember that people were starved, you know? People were locked away from food. And even bad Empanada sources claims that starving people were, you know, sent away to die, basically. So what Bad Empanada is basically just arguing that yes, it was a crime, but he just can't call it genocide, which is just a
Oh yeah, that all
ridiculous.
happened. That all happened. No serious historian
Yeah.
disputes that.
Like this is yeah, but he says he goes further. He says yes, it was a crime, but I cannot call it genocide, which is like just basically arguing semantics, you know, at this point. Because if it was a crime, then it was a crime, right?
It is semantics, but it's incredibly powerful semantics because genocide.
Yeah, invokes different
Well,
feelings.
yeah,
That's
but
the whole point.
genocide is a very serious allegation that has a lot of emotional baggage attached
Yeah,
to it.
exactly, exactly. But I still find it interesting that people that try to minimalize it or argue it are either Marxist Leninists from the West or Russia and its puppet states, basically, you know? I think it's interesting. For example, in Poland, it's not really argued at all that it's a genocide.
But definitely, if you want to know like what Russian ultranationalists and Marxist-Leninists have in common, is denial of the Holodomor.
Yeah, like the Wikipedia that's titled "The Holodomor Question," it does not have a Polish equivalent. But in Poland, it's not even taken seriously, like treating it as a question, right? So what Bera Empanada is basically just arguing that yes, it was a crime, but he just can't call it genocide, which is just a
Oh yeah, that all
ridiculous.
happened. That all happened. No serious historian
Yeah.
disputes that.
Like this is, yeah, but he says, he goes further. He says, yes, it was a crime, but I cannot call it genocide, which is like just basically arguing semantics, at this point. Because if it was a crime, then it was a crime, right?
It is semantics, but it's incredibly powerful semantics because genocide.
Yeah, invokes different
Well,
feelings.
yeah,
That's
but
the whole point.
genocide is a very serious allegation that has a lot of emotional baggage attached
Yeah,
to it.
exactly. But I still find it interesting that people that try to minimalize it or argue it are either Marxist Leninists from the West or Russia and its puppet states, basically, I think it's interesting. For example, in Poland, it's not really argued at all that it's a genocide.
But definitely, if you want to know like what Russian ultranationalists and Marxist-Leninists have in common, is denial of the Holodomor.
Yeah, like the Wikipedia that's titled "The Holodomor Question," it does not have a Polish equivalent. But in Poland, it's not even taken seriously, like treating it as a question, right? Okay. So my next question is: do you maybe have any interesting sources?
Well, I think that's a lot of down to the fact that
Yeah,
Poland, like Ukraine, has suffered a lot of Soviet violence.
yeah, and we have a lot of shared history. Going back to my personal favorite topic, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we have a lot of shared history. Some people would argue that the Ukrainian language is actually structurally closer to Polish than to Russian.
Mhm.
You know, I've actually overheard. That's a bit of an anecdotal thing, but I've overheard in the bank an older gentleman.
Makes sense considering the cultural interactions.
I've overheard an older gentleman that was like, I speak Russian. We used to all learn Russian when we were children, the older generation. And the lady in the bank said, you knowing Russian must help you a lot with speaking to the Ukrainian people. And he was like, no, actually, Polish is more similar to Ukrainian than Russian, in my opinion, you know, which was interesting to me. Okay, so I guess we will finish up for now. And if I need to ask you about anything, I will call you again, okay? More help
I wouldn't
or,
mind. I'd be more than willing to help you because I hate genocide denial.
yeah, same. Especially when it's so clear cut, to be honest. Okay, so I'll call you uh, when I want, like, had to ask you your take about the video, okay? Okay. See you, okay? More help
I wouldn't
or
mind. I'd be more than willing to help you because I hate genocide denial.
yeah, same. Especially when it's so clear cut, to be honest. Okay, so I'll call you when I want, like, had to ask you your take about the video. Okay. See you. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's the what's the chat? Gosh. Um. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. And now we continue this very, specifically thing. How are you feeling? I'm making a feelings check. How are you feeling about all this so far? How are we feeling? How are we feeling? How is everybody? Are we okay? Oh yeah. Moho. Holodomor is the great hunger of Ukraine that happened in the 30s, when basically due to a famine that was artificially created, millions of Ukrainian people died of starvation. Genocide deniers. Okay? We're simply not genocide deniers in this space.
Elman, however, does believe that there is evidence that the Soviet leadership considered some of the famine's victims to have deserved their fate. However, he says that these victims were denounced not based on their nationality or ethnicity, but rather on perceptions of them being class enemies and idlers.
Yeah, but that's the problem, isn't it? Stalin just used this excuse to kill anyone he didn't like, to murder, to do these famous purges. So that's not really an argument to me. I'm sorry. That's not an argument to me. Yeah, that's not really a serious argument to me that, oh, technically speaking, it wasn't because they were Ukrainians. Technically speaking, it's because they were enemies of the revolution. I'm sorry, this is not an argument. This is empty.
Elman believes that those who were considered to be parts of those groups were denied relief and possibly even directly killed, but said groups don't fall under any of the categories covered by the Genocide Convention, and they were definitely not targeted specifically for being Ukrainian, meaning that these mass killings cannot be considered genocide by the common definition that most of you will understand.
This is ridiculous.
He additionally notes that Russians, Ukrainians...
Empanada is such a dishonest actor. It's no wonder that nobody takes him seriously. Yeah, well, it was, Moho. Believe me, it was. It was very much a problem for millions of normal citizens. Ridiculous.
And Kazakhs were all affected greatly by the famine, which extended far beyond just Ukraine itself.
Yeah,
so while by his assessment,
Stalin killed more than just Ukrainians.
Can be attributed to Stalin's callous response.
Yeah, apart from committing genocide of the Ukrainians, Stalin also killed a lot more people. What is this supposed to prove? Yeah, Stalin also, apart from genociding Ukrainians, he also killed a lot of different people. This is like saying, hey, Hitler did not genocide the Jewish people. He also killed Romani people, and he also killed LGBT people. He also killed Polish people. What is this argument? Like, what? If you kill people aside from the group that you're genociding, then it's not a genocide anymore? Oh, that's a whole different topic, okay? We will get into it. We will do it step by step, Charlie. Don't worry. I'm on a whole arc. I'm on a whole anti-tanky arc. I'm gonna go deep into those topics.
And his poor agricultural policies, he would still support a verdict of not guilty, or possibly the Scottish verdict of not proven.
Charlie, you're part of my history team now. We're in this together.
However, go on to state that under a broader definition of genocide, which is used by many academics who study genocide, the famine might indeed be considered genocide. Under this definition, a more specific intent is not required. Rather, the offender is culpable because he knew or should have known that the act would destroy, in whole or in part, a group.
I
so
agree.
It wouldn't matter whether or not there's evidence that the Soviet government wanted to target Ukrainians. What matters is simply that they took actions that they should have or did know would result in the deaths of Ukrainians or fail to save them from death.
I actually agree
However,
with this.
As Elman goes on to note, this has much wider implications implications beyond just the USSR. The Holodomor, the purported genocidal mass starvation of Ukrainians, would not actually be exceptional at all. In fact, this would mean that Stalin also committed genocide against Kazakhs and even Russians, since he should have known.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna say it. Yeah, Stalin murdered a lot of Russians, and yeah, Stalin was awful. Yeah. Yes. What was this? Is this supposed to be a win on your part? That Stalin genocided more than one group? Are you serious? This is ridiculous. Yes, Stalin was a monster that killed a lot of people. A lot of people. Congratulations, welcome to reality. Welcome. Bad Empanada Baba. You are discovering together with us that Stalin has in fact not only genocided Ukrainian people, but also other people. Like, I'm blown away by this argument that he's saying we cannot call the genocide of Ukrainian people genocide because he also killed a lot of... Because if we did, then that would mean that Stalin has committed a lot more genocide. What? Are you serious? Yeah, I will, yeah. Stalin did even more genocide. Okay, yeah, I agree.
His policies would result in their deaths.
Yeah.
Which diminishes the idea further that he was targeting Ukrainians. He also notes that under this...
The game crashed. This is so slimy. Wait, it diminishes that he targeted Ukrainians? No, it doesn't. It doesn't diminish it. He simply targeted more than one group. Answer me this. Does the fact that the Nazis targeted the Romani people diminish the claim that, yeah, definitely. The USSR targeted Jewish people, definitely. And that's a whole other claim, yes. I will talk on it because it affected the Polish policy a lot. It actually affected the Marxist-Leninist Poland's anti-Semitic policy. So yes, Queen Charlie, you are definitely correct that Stalin did target Jewish people as well. But today we are focusing on the Great Hunger genocide against the Ukrainian people. But I will say that I will ask this. Are you saying that if the Nazis targeted, and they did target and genocide the Romani people, does that diminish the claim that the Nazis genocided the Jewish people? Because Bad Empanada basically says that yes, the fact that the Nazis targeted other types of people diminishes the claim that they genocided the Jewish population. This is like the logical consequence of what Bad Empanada is saying, more or less.
Wider definition, pretty much every Western country, including those who recognize the Holodomor as a genocide, are themselves guilty of genocide during this same time period, making it a shockingly common historical...
Oh, that's a whole different topic, okay? We will get into it. We will do it step by step, Charlie. Don't worry. I'm on a whole arc. I'm on a whole anti-tanky arc. I'm gonna go deep into those topics. Don't worry.
And his poor agricultural policies, he would still support a verdict of not guilty, or possibly the Scottish verdict of not proven.
Charlie, you're part of my history team now. We're in this together.
However, go on to state that under a broader
We're in this together,
genocide, girl, which is used by many academics who study genocide, the famine might indeed be considered genocide. Under this definition, a more specific intent is not required. Rather, the offender is culpable because he knew or should have known that the act would destroy, in whole or in part, a group.
I
So it
agree.
wouldn't matter whether or not there's evidence that the Soviet government wanted to target Ukrainians. What matters is simply that they took actions that they should have or did know would result in the deaths of Ukrainians or fail to save them from death.
I actually agree with
However,
this.
as
Yeah.
Elman goes on to note, this has much wider implications beyond just the USSR. The Holodomor, the purported genocidal mass starvation of Ukrainians, would not actually be exceptional at all. In fact, this would mean that Stalin also committed genocide against Kazakhs and even Russians, since he should have known.
Well, yeah. I'm gonna say it. Yeah. Stalin murdered a lot of Russians, and yeah. Yeah, Stalin was awful. Yeah. Yes. What was this? Is this supposed to be a win on your part? That Stalin genocided more than one group? Is this, like, are you serious? This is ridiculous. Yes, Stalin was a monster that killed a lot of people. A lot of people. Congratulations, welcome to reality. Welcome. Bad Empanada Baba. You are discovering together with us that Stalin has in fact not only genocided Ukrainian people, but also other people. Like, I'm blown away by this argument that he's saying we cannot call the genocide of Ukrainian people genocide because he also killed a lot of... Because if we did, then that would mean that Stalin has committed a lot more genocide. What? Are you serious? Yeah. Yeah, I will... Yeah. Stalin did even more genocide. Okay, yeah, I agree.
His policies would result in their deaths.
Yeah.
Which diminishes the idea further that he was targeting Ukrainians. He also notes that under this...
The game crashed. This is so slimy. Wait, it diminishes that he targeted Ukrainians? No, it doesn't. It doesn't diminish it. He simply targeted more than one group. Answer me this. Does the fact that the Nazis targeted the Romani people diminish the claim that, yeah, definitely. The USSR targeted Jewish people, definitely. And that's a whole other claim, yes. I will talk on it because it affected the Polish policy a lot. It actually affected the Marxist-Leninist Poland's anti-Semitic policy. So yes, Queen Charlie, you are definitely correct that Stalin did target Jewish people as well. But today we are focusing on the Great Hunger genocide against the Ukrainian people. But I will say that I will ask this: are you saying that if the Nazis targeted, and they did target and genocide the Romani people, does that diminish the claim that the Nazis genocided the Jewish people? Because Bad Empanada basically says that yes, the fact that the Nazis targeted other types of people diminishes the claim that they genocided the Jewish population. This is like the logical consequence of what Bad Empanada is saying, more or less.
Wider definition, pretty much every Western country, including those who recognize the Holodomor as a genocide, are themselves guilty of genocide during this same time period, making it a shockingly common historical occurrence.
How many countries in the West had from 4 to 8 million people dead due to starvation? Can I get a source on that? How many? I will play Resident Evil. You know what? Screw it, let's play it now. Origin of language, you have won me over. We will play Resident Evil right now. from the beginning. So yeah, I will say it, okay? I demand sources that would claim that the Western countries have had genocides happening, that millions of people in the West died due to starvation. Here we are. But keep in mind, Queen Charlie, that the Polish government received many reports from what was happening, many reports. There are countries that have their own sources, and Poland does have certain sources that different sources from the West, you know? So yeah, I would really need to get some data about millions of people in the West dying from starvation at the exact same time as the Great Hunger in Ukraine.
Even well into the 20th and 21st centuries.
I will just tell you this. In Poland, in the 30s, millions of people were not dying of starvation.
However, the supporters of the pro-genocide position don't take the stance that Ellman does there. Their assertion is much broader, much stronger, that the famine was intentionally planned and engineered in order to genocide Ukrainians, and that it was unambiguously a genocide under the common definition of the term. You'll see this throughout the video. Most of the rest of the pro-genocide sources presented in the wiki article are very adamant that the famine was intentionally planned and artificially induced, specifically to kill Ukrainians alone. If we look at the quality of the first source that each section here presents, there's really to the second source from the Feminist Genocide section.
Okay.
The next citation is of Raphael Lemkin, who was the lawyer who actually coined the term genocide. The quote here is from notes for a speech that he gave in 1953. He wrote, "What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. The third prong of the Soviet plan was aimed at the farmers, the large mass of independent peasants who are the repository of tradition, folklore and music, national language and literature, the national spirit of Ukraine." As a Soviet politician, Kosior
Does Empanada deny that Russification was a thing as well? Because it was definitely a thing. And it was like Russification is so well documented that you would really have to be a loon in denial to say that Russification was not a thing. Like that would be oof. Well, you know. Was Lemkin a Marxist-Leninist? Was he a Marxist-Leninist, Queen? Queen Charlie, was he a Marxist-Leninist? Answer me this. Then his opinion is invalid. Bam! There, got him. Polish Jew? Opinion invalid. Not even a real comrade. Enemy of the revolution. What are you talking about? Opinion disregarded. Got him. Got him. Got him. There we
declared
go.
in Izvestia on the 2nd of December 1933,
Got him.
nationalism is our chief danger. And it was to eliminate that nationalism, to establish the horrifying uniformity of the Soviet state, that the Ukrainian peasantry was sacrificed. The crop that year was ample to feed the people and livestock of Ukraine, though it had fallen off somewhat from the previous year.
Okay, this is good. This is turning into a mess, so I'm just gonna do this for a bit. You can still hear me, right? Yeah.
A decrease probably due in large
I'm just gonna do this for a bit.
measure to the struggle over collectivization. But a famine was necessary for the Soviets, and so they got one to order, by plan, through an unusually high grain allotment to the state as taxes.
Yeah.
While Lemkin certainly deserves credit for coining the term genocide and beginning the study of many events through that lens, his opinion here is not actually very relevant to the question at hand.
Oh, he can be
This is
very
one of the only
deranged.
records we have of him ever discussing the Holodomor, and
He
it's
can
not
be
actually
very
a historical
deranged.
study.
I
Rather,
know.
it's just some notes that he wrote for himself without giving any actual citations, with no evidence to back up his claims beyond just a single short quote. Another huge problem with this source is its age. Generally, the older a historical work is, the less relevant it is, as more recent work takes into account, builds upon, and supersedes what came before it. And in this case, we're also talking about someone's brief notes. So it was never actually a proper historical study in the first place.
I see.
In 1953, and indeed for many decades still afterwards, study of the Soviet famines of 1932 to 33 was very difficult due to a...
I'm gonna tell you. You know what? I'm making a new rule. If the study is not Marxist-Leninist, then it's invalid. Any study that is not Marxist-Leninist is invalid. No. You're mistaken. You're in denial.
complete lack of sources. There were some witness accounts along with the public statements by the Soviet government, but they kept most of their info on the famine secret. Thus, there was just nowhere near enough evidence to make any sound conclusions regarding the famine being genocide or not. Though some, of course, tried anyway, and we'll get to more of them soon enough because they're also cited in this wiki article. All of this changed starting in 1987, when the Soviet government opened their archives. For the first time, internal documents regarding the famine were available to historians, and the result was a drastic shift in scholarship. Beforehand, it was commonly thought that the famine was intentionally planned to kill Ukrainians, regardless of how little evidence.
I'm gonna tell you this thing. This is like a bigger thing for the West, because in the 30s, many reports of what was happening in the USSR were coming non-stop to the Polish government in the 30s, and it is used as a source in the Polish Wikipedia. So, no. There were reliable sources that were happening in real time in the 30s as it was happening, because Poland is much closer to the USSR. Okay? It makes sense, right? It's closer. So of course Poland got the news much faster.
There actually was for this conclusion. But after 1987, as those scouring the archives came up short on any evidence for that there, the consensus shifted to be more measured. So anything from before the archives were opened became pretty much totally obsolete. Compared to the scholarship that's been released since, it's really just utter trash, to be honest, based on little more than conjecture and massive logical leaps. A source like this is flatly irrelevant to the scholarly consensus on the matter, regardless of Lemkin's personal prestige. Not only did he simply not have access to anything resembling sufficient evidence to form the conclusions that he makes in his notes, not only did he write this before serious study of the famine had even began, and
actually, Rafał Lemkin. There we go. Rafał Lemkin. W miejscowości Bezwoda, guberni zmarł. He died in New York. When did he move to the US? Let me see. This is so dishonest, I swear. Dishonesty after
and thus
dishonesty.
lacked all the insight that it has since provided, but also the work itself is just scribbled notes for a speech, not an actual well-sourced peer-reviewed work. Its inclusion here is therefore very suspect. This seems
You
to be
are
another
very
attempt
suspect.
to bolster the pro-genocide section with low-quality sources that seem reliable only at a glance. The editors of the page also added a number of modern opinions to boost Lemkin's here, something which was not done in any other part of the article,
Okay.
and none of these actually provide any additional evidence that would support his conclusion that the famine was a planned genocide. One is from historian Roman Serban, who merely summarizes what Lemkin was implying, doing nothing to actually support his conclusions. Another's from historian Timothy Snyder, who we'll be addressing in detail later, as he's included in his own right in the article. He states that the Soviets made sure the term genocide, contrary to Lemkin's intentions, excluded political and economic groups. According to Snyder, the Ukrainian famine could be presented as somehow less genocidal because it targeted a class, kulaks, as well as a nation, Ukraine. This again provides none of the desperately needed evidence to bolster Lemkin's conclusions, and doesn't actually address what he wrote on the matter at all. Rather, it makes certain inferences regarding Lemkin's original intentions for the term genocide, which is only tangentially relevant.
Is this the best that the Marxist-Leninists can do?
Regardless, even though it's kind of irrelevant, I'm gonna fact-check the claim. Did the Soviets make sure that genocide excluded political and economic groups, contrary to Lemkin's intent? Snyder doesn't provide a source for this claim in the book in question. This is going to be a recurring theme among the sources cited in this article, by the way. But it's easy enough to find information on this elsewhere.
HD.
It's true that when the UN Genocide Convention was being drafted back in 1949, the Soviet delegation was opposed to including political groups in it on the stated grounds that the term genocide etymologically referred to immutable traits like race or tribe. But this was hardly unique to the Soviets. It was also a common opinion among many other delegations. As genocide scholar William Shabas wrote, rigorous examination fails to confirm a popular impression in the literature that the opposition to inclusion of political genocide was some Soviet machination. The Soviet views were shared by a number of other states, for whom it is difficult to establish any geographic or social common denominator. Lebanon, Sweden, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, the Philippines, the Dominican Republic, Iran, Egypt, Belgium, and Uruguay. The exclusion of political groups was in fact originally promoted by a non-governmental organization, the World Jewish Congress, and it corresponded to Raphael Lemkin's vision of the nature of the crime of genocide. As you can see from that quote, it's also not exactly true that Lemkin intended to include political groups in the definition himself. He did at times write about them, but during the actual drafting of the Genocide Convention that Snyder is referring to there, a process which Lemkin had a central part in, he preferred to omit political groups, as they lacked the required permanency of other included groups, such as ethnicity and race. And contrary to Snyder's additional claim there regarding economic groups, Lemkin not only never considered them to be possible victims of genocide, but that inclusion was never even seriously considered during the drafting of the convention at all. So Snyder is just lying there. It's a lie. And we can see pretty clearly why he didn't cite a source, because the sources disprove him. So to paint this as the Soviet Union making a desperate move to exclude political groups against Lemkin's
desperate what? Nobody claims that's a desperate move. Nobody ever claims this. No one.
Misleading. Especially since the Soviet delegation explicitly advocated that the killing of political groups should still be considered a crime against humanity. And in general, the Soviet delegation was actually in favor of a much broader definition of genocide, arguing that what is today called cultural genocide should have been included in the convention. Now, this was actually much more in line with Lemkin's intent. During the drafting of the Genocide Convention, he fought bitterly for it to be included. In his biography, he wrote, "We reached the article on cultural genocide. This idea was very dear to me. I defended it successfully through 2 drafts, but many delegations fell silent when I endeavored to explain the importance of this matter. After having overcome so many hurdles and with the end of the assembly in sight, I questioned the wisdom of engaging in still another battle. Would it endanger the passage of the convention?
Oh yeah.
So with a heavy
Not only
heart,
did
I
the
decided not to
USSR
press
not
for
commit any genocide.
It was not the Soviets who lobbied against this. Rather,
they
it was
actually
opposed by
wanted,
Western countries such as Britain, who were afraid that it could be used to prosecute them for actions in their colonies. So the notion that the convention ended up narrowly defining genocide due to a Soviet conspiracy just doesn't sit with the facts. It's also completely nonsensical to include Snyder's inaccurate assertion in this article.
Also, before anyone says anything, yes, what the British Empire did in its colonies in India was mass genocide. Yes, 100%, yeah. But it doesn't change the fact that what happened in Ukraine was also genocide. Thank you.
In the first place, because the claim made by the pro-genocide camp is not even of a genocide against an economic or political group in the first place, but rather one
I don't care about
Ukrainians,
technicalities.
meaning a national or ethnic group.
I keep dying.
And Lemkin clearly meant that in his notes on the matter. So not only are Snyder's claims misleading at best, they're just irrelevant. The only reason they're here is because someone wanted to shoehorn into this article the idea that the Soviets nefariously manipulated the law to get away with the Holodomor. And the Wikipedia community has apparently since found nothing wrong with this. So I just spent like 800 words of this script debunking something that's completely irrelevant to the article because of this. Whoever you are, Wikipedia editor, I hate you. 2 more quotes from scholars who are just summarizing Lemkin's position are then also included on top of the previous ones for some reason, both still not actually providing any evidence for his position. Overall, none of these 4 additional inclusions actually do anything to make Lemkin's opinion on the famine any more valuable. He remains a source that's entirely too old, lacking in evidence and quality, and that doesn't actually address the question in any depth, instead making sweeping assertions with no explanation for how they were formed. Lemkin's inclusion in this article amounts to nothing more than an appeal to authority. He coined the term genocide, so the reader is supposed to give him special weight, rather than assessing his writing on the subject on its own merits. If you do, it's clear that it doesn't even remotely meet basic academic standards, nor even Wikipedia standards.
Basically it's arguing semantics.
So far for the famine as genocide section. Let's finally move on to the next source in the not genocide section. This one is from Stephen Kotkin, another historian who's a specialist on the Soviet Union. He's written numerous books on Stalin where he sticks to the common image of him as a brutal, murderous dictator, and he's made it very clear before.
Yeah, because he was a brutal, murderous dictator. You can pretend he wasn't, you can say he wasn't as a Marxist-Leninist, but he was. It's not a common picture. It's fact. What do you mean? Ridiculous. I'm sorry. It's just ridiculous.
That he's an ideological anti-communist, with articles that he's published in the mainstream press.
Well, you're an ideological Marxist-Leninist. That's far, far worse.
Titled things like Communism's Bloody Century, where he enthusiastically states his support for free markets and private property. So clearly, about as far as you could get from an ideological Stalinist. Definitely not sympathetic towards Stalin or the...
I'm sorry, but being an ideological Stalinist is a bankrupt position. Sorry, not sorry.
USSR, even a little
Stalinist?
bit. In fact, he's probably biased against them. I think that's fair to say. He directly addressed the question of whether or not the famine was a planned genocide in the 2nd volume of his biography of Stalin, released in 2017. Kotkin says that, funnily enough, the Soviet leadership themselves were the first ones to believe...
I really hate it when there's a crime committed against millions and the question, and he's not even making a case that the crime was not committed, but rather argues on the semantics. This is slimy, this is dishonest, this is very typical of Marxist-Leninists. This is their modus operandi, I guess.
Believe that the famine was planned, but not by themselves in order to kill Ukrainians, rather by well-off peasants in order to undermine the government's agricultural collectivization policy. He ends up concluding that the famine was not intentional, both not in this way, nor as a planned extermination of Ukrainians. Rather, it was an unforeseen consequence of Stalin's agricultural policies. He additionally notes that, because the famine also affected other regions, including Russia and Kazakhstan, in the latter more people died relative to overall population than in Ukraine, that there was no Ukrainian famine. The famine was Soviet. However, instead
This is not a good argument. This is not a good argument. Like, what? The famine happened elsewhere, so there was no Ukrainian famine, but a Soviet one? Okay, this is not a good argument.
Instead of directly citing Kotkin's scholarly work on the subject, the wiki page instead sources an interview with him, and it picks and chooses what parts to include and what parts to leave out. It states, according to Stephen Kotkin, while there is no question of Stalin's responsibility for the famine, and many deaths could have been prevented if not for the insufficient and counterproductive Soviet measures, there is no evidence for Stalin's intention to kill the Ukrainians deliberately. According to Kotkin, the Holodomor was a foreseeable byproduct of the collectivization campaign that Stalin forcibly imposed, but not an intentional murder. He needed the peasants to produce more grain and to export the grain to buy the industrial machinery for industrialization. Peasant output and peasant production was critical for Stalin's industrialization. There's a very relevant part immediately following this, however, that's left out of the wiki article, which I feel really solidifies Kotkin's stance. There is no shortage of documentation when Stalin committed intentional murder. However, there is no documentation showing that he intended to starve Ukraine or that he intended to starve the peasants. So
this is very weaselly. This is very weaselly. Did you know that there is not a single... Did you know that Hitler did not sign a single document regarding the Holocaust against the Jewish people? Wow. I guess it must mean Hitler was innocent in all of that. I mean, he probably did sign some other executions, right? So this must mean, Hitler was innocent, right? This is ridiculous. But I will actually look into it. True. Clip and ship it. Let me see. Although Stalin was perfectly aware that there was not enough food, he still demanded in 1932 that Ukraine gives 7 million tons of grain. And so, by trying to fill the norms, even seeds that were supposed to be used to, even seeds that were used to that were supposed to create new crops were taken away. Even horses were dying from hunger. And when horses were dying, people would eat them, but then the government would take away the horses' corpses as well. They did, yeah. The starving people tried to run away, but Stalin did not was not about to permit that. And so he trapped people and did not enable them to escape. I don't think just eating grass is enough for the horses. Close to 5 million victims. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is ridiculous.
Kotkin comes out both against the idea that the famine was intentional to kill Ukrainians, as well as Elman's idea that it was meant to be a punishment of peasants in general. He also directly refutes the point that Elman brought up of peasants not being allowed to leave Ukraine, stating that its significance is overblown and the motivations behind it were not to kill.
Some guy says that it was overblown. Oh, nice. So your source is that some guy said that it was overblown. Wow, I'm convinced. There is a story about how tiny black peasants moving from regions of starvation to the areas where there might have been more food. With all those documents, we all know that the roughly same farmers in Ukraine, about 2,000 peasants were caught up in the international protests. The regime's motivation for this was to prevent the spread of disease that accompanied. Oh, the spread of disease. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, they were just trying to stop the spreading of disease, everybody. Does that remind you of something? Can I tell you what this reminds me? Of? There was one other part of history when there was a group of people in history that was trapped in order to stop them from, quote-unquote, spreading disease. Do you know what it was? Oh yeah. It was when the Jewish people were trapped by the ghetto wall during World War II. When Jewish people were forced to build their own wall, guarding their own ghetto, trapping them inside, because the Nazis said that the Jewish people would spread disease. Ridiculous.
Kill Ukrainians, but rather to prevent the spread of disease.
Interesting, huh? Interesting that the Nazis used the same excuse of not spreading disease to trap the Jewish population in the ghettos behind a wall. Interesting.
There is a story about how Stalin blocked peasants' movement from the regions of starvation to the areas where there might have been more food. With all those documents, we know that of the roughly 17 million farmers in Ukraine, about 200,000 peasants were caught up in this interdiction process. The regime's motivation for this was to prevent the spread of disease that accompanied the famine that the regime caused, however unintentionally. While he disagrees with Elman on these points, the two.
So basically, they might have caused them to starve to death. They might have trapped them when they were trying to find food. But it wasn't to kill them. It was just to stop the spread of a disease. Okay. This is not dishonest in the slightest. And the source is a person just saying it was overblown.
Two of them are definitely in agreement that the famine doesn't constitute genocide by the common definition of the term, and definitely not in the way that the pro-genocide camp commonly asserts.
Oh wow. So basically we're just arguing semantics.
They agree that it was not intentionally planned, and that Ukrainians were not specifically targeted. This is again a high quality source in comparison to those thus far included in the pro-genocide section. Nonetheless, the way it's presented in this article is very reductive. Only a short passage.
Oh, reductive. I see. I guess that was not presented from the perspective of a Marxist-Leninist,
From an interview is included, whereas the editors decided to bolster Lemkin's writing on the subject by including the opinions of 4 scholars. The contrast between both the quality of these sources and the way they're treated by Wikipedia is quite stark. So, thus far we have 2 very low quality sources in the pro-genocide section, one of which is little more than a passing reference, while the other presents no evidence and is literally 70 years old, in contrast with 2 opinions of modern scholars in the non-genocide section, whom have cited a lot of evidence and directly addressed.
Sorry, I was muted. I would like to add that both pro and quote-unquote anti-genocide sources do not claim that no crime was committed against the populace. So, what does the amazing Marxist-Leninist Empanada has to say about that? What have you got to say about that, Empanada? Is the only thing that Marxist-Leninists are capable of doing are frankly desperately arguing semantics to make themselves look slightly better.
The arguments of other modern scholars on the matter, yet the article nonetheless presents all of these as if they're somehow equal, and 99% of readers will probably come away from it thinking exactly that, just as the editors collectively would have liked them to. Let's move on to the third source in the pro-genocide.
This is making me angry. I want to prepare an in-depth study session about the Great Hunger, okay? I'm gonna pull out all the sources and we're gonna make a part 2 to this stream. This is basically, I'm treating this as like a intro, and I'm not really putting any strong counters so far, but I'm gonna prepare more. This is ridiculous. Yeah. That's right, couple. That's right. Like, this is basically the same, to me, personally, this is the same level of denial as this weird bearded guy did about Zanderhal.
Section. The opinion of the late historian.
But in this case, it's about millions of people.
And Robert Conquest, who was a specialist on the Soviet Union. Conquest openly described himself as a cold warrior, meaning a writer who considered themselves to be partisan fighters in the propaganda arena during the Cold War. In Conquest's case, the side that he fought for was certainly the West. And this is a 100% accurate description of him that he himself certainly would have agreed with. He didn't hide his biases at all, in fact he owned them. So I'm not trying to poison the well here. He just factually was a pro-West, anti-Soviet polemicist, and he relished in that. So he's evidently quite a biased source.
He doesn't simp for women. He's too busy stalking her and harassing them. Got him! Empanada is too busy harassing women. This is really ridiculous. Calling out any bias from a Marxist-Leninist, I will always treat as a joke. I'm sorry. Marxist-Leninists are the last people on earth that are able to call out bias. I'm sorry. Is this a joke? Marxist-Leninists talking about bias?
But bias alone is no reason to discount his work entirely. The wiki article cites his book on the famine, The Harvest of Sorrow, which was co-written with historian James Mace and released in 1986. This book was one of the first academic works that specifically addressed the question of whether the famine was planned and then induced as an intentional attempt to starve Ukrainians or not. Conquest concluded both that it was and that it was a genocide. and interestingly, cited the aforementioned notes by Raphael Lemkin in doing so. Conquest's work, biased as it may have been, was still a serious argument, and one that, at least at the time, could not simply be ignored. Even those who disagree with its conclusions still nonetheless cite the book to this day, because it still includes useful eyewitness accounts and translations of Soviet documents. Conquest did not, however, actually uncover any direct evidence that the famine had been planned or had specifically targeted Ukrainians. Rather, he relied on some very broad inferences and circumstantial evidence, a practice which perhaps made more sense at the time since access to secret Soviet government documents was non-existent then. However, literally the next year, the Soviet archives started to be opened, and the lack of any evidence uncovered there heavily complicated his conclusions. Conquest, despite his clear biases and his open acknowledgement of the fact that he intentionally wrote anti-Soviet propaganda, was nonetheless capable of admitting it when new evidence came out that proved him wrong. After the archives failed to produce any evidence supporting the intentional famine thesis, he corresponded with scholars Stephen Wheatcroft and Robert Davies, whose work we're going to be getting into very soon. They noted that, while in his writings and speeches from the 80s, Conquest constantly made claims like Stalin wanted a famine, and that the famine was deliberately inflicted for its own sake, when writing to them, he heavily dialed back these conclusions, instead stating that Stalin purposefully inflicted the 1933 famine? No. What I argue is that with resulting famine imminent, he could have prevented it, but put Soviet interest other than feeding the starving first, thus consciously abetting it. That is a huge departure from his original book.
Be it as it may, as much as it is a departure from his original claim, I am sorry, but choosing the Soviet interest first and choosing to starve millions of people to death is still genocide. Repeat after me. Choosing a state's interests and choosing to let millions of people to starve is genocide. Are you gonna argue that it's not? Are you serious?
Book, which painted the famine as a planned and engineered genocide of Ukrainians. Wheatcroft and Davies also note that Conquest even stopped.
Oh wow, so instead of being a planned and engineered genocide of Ukrainians, it was a genocide out of choice. This makes it so much better. Wow, that's the better genocide. That's the justified genocide, is it?
Calling the famine a genocide later in his life. So to include him in the pro-genocide section here is puzzling, since he clearly changed his mind later on and no longer considered it to be a genocide. And the worst thing about—
No, he did. Yes, he did. What do you mean? It's still a genocide if you choose the state before the lives of millions. What?
This is that all of this is included in the Wikipedia article. It says that he wrote a book in the 80s where he claimed the famine was a planned genocide, then later changed his stance after the expected evidence of this.
Are you kidding?
This really comes off as just another desperate inclusion to bolster what would otherwise be a pretty empty pro-genocide section. It in fact just contradicts itself without elaborating at all.
No, it did not.
Conquest supported
it did not contradict itself. Are you kidding, you hack? I just explained why. Am I? Yeah, it's sparkling mass murder. This is ridiculous. This is what Marxist-Leninists are. This is what I'm gonna enjoy my anti-tanky arc.
That the famine was a planned act of genocide. Then, without elaborating at all, 1 second later, it says that he later changed his mind to the exact opposite. That's just going to leave the reader very confused.
The exact opposite? Did we just hear the same thing? The exact opposite? Okay, first it was engineered from the start to mass genocide Ukrainians, and then it's changed to Stalin chose the state and allowed the Ukrainians to starve to death, which is not the opposite. Are you serious? Are you serious? This is not the opposite. Not by a long shot.
Going to be thinking,
no, it's not the opposite.
Why is he in the pro-genocide section? What's even going on? So conquest...
What's going on is that Empanada is a dishonest hack. That is what's going on. It's ridiculous.
Really shouldn't even be in the pro-genocide section of the article at all, because he was most recently against the idea that it was genocide. It would actually make infinitely more sense to put him in the opposite section, because if someone as openly biased as Conquest changed his opinion on the matter,
it would not
damning for the planned and engineered genocide claim, especially since his book on the matter was one of the first seriously popular academic attempts to argue that position, and those who still hold that position often still rely entirely on citing his book. So the scholar who was essentially the founding father of that argument himself renounced it, yet he's still for some reason included in the pro-genocide camp on
because
Wikipedia.
It's still a kind of genocide.
Section.
Oh my God.
Not looking good. The next citation in the no genocide section is of specialist in the Soviet economy, Robert Davies, and specialist in Soviet history, Stephen Wheatcroft. These two often wrote about the Holodomor as a team, hence why they're listed together. And they've written a whole lot on the subject, as well as a whole lot specifically on the genocide question, probably more than any other authors in fact. Their work on the famine has been very important, as they bring an attention to detail on the economic side of things that had largely been ignored beforehand. While authors like Conquest look for explanations in speeches and eyewitness accounts, primarily searching for ways to blame Stalin, Wheatcroft and Davies combined those with detailed assessments of the economic data released following the opening of the Soviet archives. Their book along these lines, The Years of Hunger, is now pretty much required reading on the subject, and Wheatcroft especially has written a lot more on it since. In the preface to the revised edition of this book, their position is made very clear. In our work, we have found no evidence that the Soviet authorities undertook a program of genocide against Ukraine. The book's conclusion elaborates on this. We do not add...
This is also very dishonest framing, because as Queen Charlie has pointed out, as I will concur, just because it was not a ground-up engineered genocide, it does not follow that the USSR did not commit a genocide at all. This is very dishonest framing. Yeah, there is no evidence that it was a ground-up genocide that was engineered. But there is evidence, as you yourself read, that Stalin chose the interest of the USSR and allowed millions of people to die. Yeah, sure, Moho. Yeah, that's how it works. That's exactly how it works. All you have to do is apologize. You know what? No, you don't have to apologize, Moho. All you have to do is become a Marxist-Leninist. Once you become a Marxist-Leninist, genocide becomes okay.
At all absolve Stalin from responsibility for the famine. His policies towards the peasants were ruthless and brutal, but the story which has emerged in this book is of a Soviet leadership which was struggling with a famine crisis which had been caused partly by their wrong-headed policies, but was
partly by the wrong-headed policies. Can I have a citation? Will you read us a citation that was partly due to wrong-headed policies, but Empanada, or are we just gonna say it and not show us anything? Are you just gonna say it?
Expected and undesirable. The background to the famine is not simply that Soviet agricultural policies
they say it was undesirable. Okay.
Derived from Bolshevik ideology, though ideology played its part. They were also shaped by the Russian pre-revolutionary past, the experiences of the Civil War.
Capo, it's like, It's not genocide if it's simply true. This is so dishonest, Queen Charlie. This is so dishonest. Like, yeah, I guess. Empanada da 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 da. Yeah. But I will tell you this. It is the height of dishonesty to say that it wasn't genocide because Stalin simply chose to let millions of people to die from starvation because he chose the USSR. This is cope. I'm sorry.
The international situation, the intransigent circumstances of geography and the weather, and the modus operandi of the Soviet system as it was established under Stalin. They were formulated by men with little formal education and limited knowledge of agriculture. Above all, they were the consequence of the decision to industrialize this peasant country at breakneck speed. So for Davies and Wheatcraft...
I mean, yeah, that's true. It was the consequence of wanting to industrialize it at a breaking speed, which was impossible to do, which caused the famine. Yeah. It doesn't stop being a genocide because it's the result of demanding the impossible. Stalin knew he was demanding the impossible. He just didn't care about people dying. That is what it's called. This is what we call a genocide. Okay? Yes. Allowing people to die on purpose is what we call a genocide. Yeah, of course. It's not genocide if you just choose to let people die, rather than engineer it from the ground up. This is ridiculous.
Analyzed the economic data in much more detail than anyone else before them, the famine was not a genocide of Ukrainians or any other national group. Rather, it was the result of a failure of agricultural policy combined with environmental factors such as drought and low rainfall that created a grain shortfall. The primary failure of policy was the disastrous attempt to rapidly force peasants to move away from traditional small...
So basically, it was not engineered as a genocide, but it was a policy that everybody could have predicted that would lead to it, and Stalin still chose to do it. Do you know what that means? And he also still could have sent grain. Those are two arguments, okay? What do you know what that means? It means it's a genocide. You hack. I can't believe it. Ooh. This is just... I don't know. This is heavy.
Holding and into collective farming. With hindsight, they say that these policies were at the very least implemented way too fast. But Soviet leaders of the day didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They earnestly believed...
I'm sorry, but you have to be a total hack if you don't believe that a breakneck pace, that there was no precedence of doing something like... I'm sorry, this is ridiculous. Everybody knew that it would not work. What? They did not have the hindsight of knowing that a maniacal dictator that has no speciality in either of these fields creating a haphazard plan would not work? You really need a power of hindsight to understand that a single person just thinking up a plan to industrialize a country in 5 years would not work? How could he have known that people need food to survive? This is so ridiculous.
Believed in these policies and were not implementing them with the goal of intentionally killing it.
Oh, they believed in those policies. Oh. Wait, so is Bad Empanada actually pushing the argument that they did not do it on purpose, but they were just idiots? Is this what the argument is from Bad Empanada? That the Soviet Union was just run by idiots, and hence it's not genocide? Is that basically the argument that is being made? There is just incompetence, stupidity at play? Is that it? It's okay because people in charge were just really, really stupid?
Anyone. Rather, they hoped for the exact opposite outcome, to produce more food to feed more people and...
Oh, so they hoped to feed more people by not feeding people and by causing a famine. Okay.
to sell. Possibly Wheatcroft and Davies' biggest contribution to the discussion is their estimate, using material from the archives, of a substantial grain shortfall of around 10 million tons in 1931 and 1932. This showed that, contrary to the assumption long held by the pro-genocide camp, that there was an adequate harvest which authorities intentionally kept from the peasants to starve them, the famine was the result of a legitimate food shortage. And thus the central question regarding the famine is not,
Yeah, it was a legitimate food shortage because the Soviet Union went ahead with a plan that would cause the food shortage, knowing that it would cause the shortage, and they went ahead because they wanted to industrialize no matter what the cause. Thank you, Obscurus. Thank you so much. Wait, can you like a stream on Twitch as it's happening? Twitch has a like function? Wait, Obscurus, does Twitch have a like function? Wait, you like the Badampadabadaba video? Obscurus, no! No, don't like the Obscurus, please don't do this to me. Oh my god. Oh no. Obscurus, please don't do this to me. Don't do this to me. I can't. Obscurus, are you a Marxist-Leninist or something? I can't believe this. I am disappointed.
Stalin intentionally withhold food from Ukrainians,
And yes, also, he did withhold food from Ukrainians.
but rather what caused the shortage. This is backed up.
We know what caused the shortage. You yourself read in a previous source that Stalin chose the good of the USSR before the lives of millions. That is still genocide, you hack. Obscurus, you like the video of a hack.
By Wheatcroft and Davies' archival research, which uncovered evidence of previously unknown secret relief measures carried out by the government, which refuted another common argument among the pro-genocide camp that the government intentionally did not provide relief to starving peasants from their supposedly ample grain surplus. Wheatcroft notes that it was these two revelations specifically which changed Conquest's mind on the subject. Conquest had previously believed that Stalin intentionally withheld abundant stocks of food from Ukrainians, and that his government had refused practically all relief. But this evidence showed otherwise, rendering Conquest's conclusions invalid. Wheatcroft also notes that the pro-genocide position has regained popularity in recent times, not due to legitimate...
By the way, here's a follow-up video mocking people disliking his video. Oh, don't worry. This is ridiculous. I'm going to make a follow-up stream to this stream because I'm gonna go hard. I'm gonna go hard into like I'm gonna go really hard into researching this topic, okay? I'm gonna go hard. Don't worry.
Scholarly validity, but rather for purely political reasons. He wrote, "Discussions in the popular narrative of famine have changed over the years. During Soviet times, there was a contrast between man-made famine and denial of famine. Man-made at this time largely meant as a result of policy. Then there was a contrast between man-made on purpose and man-made on accident, with charges of criminal neglect and..."
I'm sorry, but criminal neglect that leads to the death of millions is genocide. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And cover-up. This stage seemed to have ended in 2004, when Robert Conquest agreed that the famine was not man-made on purpose. But in the following 10 years, there has been a revival of the man-made on purpose side. This reflects both a reduced interest in understanding the economic history and increased attempts by the Ukrainian government to classify the famine as a genocide.
Ridiculous.
It is time to return to paying more attention to economic explanations. So if you think that the Holodomor was an intentional genocide of Ukrainians, it's probably not because the academic scholarship dictates so, more because there's a political narrative being spread. The Wikipedia...
This is such a dishonest reading. Yeah, okay, I will agree based on this that there was no orchestrated genocide plan from day one. But do you know what I will say? I will say that Stalin wanted to industrialize the USSR really fast, in 5 years in fact, and dictated a plan that was impossible to do, that caused a famine. It was known that it would cause such a famine, and they went with it anyway because they wanted to industrialize no matter the cost. They didn't care that millions would die. Millions died. It's a genocide. That is my take on it. I'm sorry for not being a crazy Marxist-Leninist.
The article, however, doesn't go near into the level of detail regarding their views as I just did. Rather, it actually tries to delegitimize Wheatcroft and Davies and obfuscate just how categorically they've asserted that the famine was not murder nor genocide. For example, it cites Wheatcroft's review of a book on how this famine affected Kazakhstan, stating that Wheatcroft comments that nomadic and peasant culture was destroyed.
And yes, if other people were killed as well, it doesn't mean that the genocide of a group did not happen. This is a ridiculous claim. Once again, saying that the Germans killed the Romani people apart from the Jewish people doesn't mean that the Nazis did not genocide Jewish people. It's ridiculous. It would be ridiculous if anyone tried to claim this. But in here, he's saying this about the Ukrainians and Kazakhstan, that the Kazakhs.
Destroyed by Soviet collectivization, which complies with Raphael Lemkin's older concept of genocide, which included cultural destruction as an aspect of the crime, such as that of North American Indians and Australian Aborigines.
Literally,
however, this is just a lie.
This is literally an hour of arguing semantics.
Wheatcroft was summarizing an argument in a book that he was reviewing. He was not stating this as his own opinion. It was someone else's argument that he was restating for the benefit of someone who might want to buy the book. Yet whoever made this edit nonetheless decided to cite an obscure book review and misleadingly present this as Wheatcroft's own view. This has the clear effect of making the reader think that perhaps Wheatcroft and Davies' opinion that the famine was not genocide is not as strong as it actually is. And it is very strong since they've argued just that repeatedly for 2 decades. This section then also includes a criticism of Wheatcroft and Davies from the aforementioned Michael Ellman, essentially just restating Ellman's opinion on the matter that we addressed earlier. This is fine, I guess, but the question has to be asked, why not then also include Wheatcroft and Davies' criticism of Ellman in his section, or Wheatcroft and Davies' criticism of Conquest in his section? With the evident bias of the article up to this point, The only conclusion can be because they argued much more strongly for the genocide conclusion than Ellman did, and the article is picking and choosing what to include or not to try and make the no genocide camp look far less dominant than it actually is. Wheatcroft and Davies are two of the strongest and most well-regarded researchers on this subject, whose writing pretty much definitively trashed any remaining notion that the famine was intentional. But the reader really isn't going to come
No. It did not trash the notion that the famine was intentional. It only disputes that it was planned and engineered from the start, you dishonest hack. No, not one of them argued that at no point... It seems like I have to repeat it for the third time. The argument Baba is making is that the argument that he's making is that it is debunked that any intentional famine happened. And that is not the case. What he is demonstrating is that no engineered genocide from the very beginning was present. But the truth is what Queen Charlie has pointed out, that it was the result of a really bad policy that everyone could have predicted would have caused such a famine. Trying to rapidly industrialize the country in 5 years, which was the idea of Stalin, who had no expertise in any of those things. I'm sorry. One of the sources clearly said that Stalin chose to allow people to starve in order to push for the industrialization of the country. It is genocide. I'm sorry. You can keep coping. It is a genocide.
From their section here with anything resembling that idea. So far that's 3 out of 3 for quality, modern, specialist academic opinions that the famine was not a genocide, and 0 out of 3 for the notion that it was.
Like, this is ridiculous, Cope. This is ridiculous.
The fourth source listed in the pro-genocide section is historian James Mace. Mace was an uncredited co-author on Conquest's book on the subject, and their conclusions were pretty much the exact same, based on all the same evidence, and formed before the archives had opened and shook things up. Mace died in 2004, and in the last thing that he wrote on the subject, an essay published that same year, he cites things that himself and Conquest wrote in the 80s as if nothing had changed at all since then, while ignoring every single development in the study of the famine in the 2 decades since, including his own co-author's retraction, then moves on practically immediately, just sort of ranting against the left. It's a political polemic more than anything. He literally cites George Orwell's 1984 here as if it was a history book that had proven anything about Stalin, rather than just a work of allegorical fiction. It's the 1984 meme come to life. This is not a serious assessment of the evidence at all. It really isn't even a serious work of academic scholarship. It does demonstrate pretty clearly that Mace's opinion on the famine remained that it was genocide up until his death, but it also shows that he flat out refused to reckon with the new evidence and scholarship on the matter that contradicted he and Conquest's original conclusions. To cite Mace in the Wikipedia article separately here is basically just like citing Robert Conquest twice. The same Robert Conquest who retracted his original conclusions. Sure, Mace never did so, but his writing on the matter shows clearly that he also never engaged with new scholarship and never tried to defend he and Conquest's original conclusions against the torrent of rebuttals that came in the 90s and early 2000s. The Wikipedia article even notes that he named it as a genocide in 1986, while the Soviet archives remained closed and without direct evidence of the authorities' intent. If that's the case, then why is such a clearly outdated assessment statement, which was made without anything resembling adequate evidence, included in the article. This is like if Wheatcroft and Davies were each cited separately in the No Genocide section just to make it so there was one more person there, despite the fact they hold identical conclusions and often worked as a team. Except in their case, neither of them has ever admitted that their original conclusion was wrong, and their writing on the subject is much more recent and higher quality in general, so it's significantly dumber that Mace is included separately here. Including Conquest in the pro-genocide section was already very, very sus, given his retraction, but including his co-author separately is even more egregious. It just makes it even clearer that the article has been intentionally crafted to bolster the planned genocide side, with as many names as possible, to make it look like that's where—
This is ridiculous. Baba is basically making our quote-unquote argument that since it was not planned from the beginning, it was not a genocide at all. I'm going to read a quote right now that was provided to me by Charlie. Even though Ukrainian historians claim there were unique reasons for famine in every region, according to documents, the famine onset mechanism was common everywhere. It was due to the collectivization, peasant resistance in 1932, punishing peasants with famine to strengthen the regime and enforce the kolkhoz system. Yes, that is correct. No other mechanisms can be traced from the documents. I shall not deny the fact that the famine in 1932, 1933, and overall economic crisis in Ukraine gave cause to Stalin's regime to take preventative measures against the Ukrainian national movement and in the future against the potential social base, intelligentsia, state government members, peasantry, when a conflict of USSR with its enemies ripened and burst out. There we go. There we have it. Yeah, exactly. It is like dropping your keys and then like arguing you didn't drop your keys because you didn't want to. Like, this is like the whole Batman Begins meme when Batman says to Ra's al Ghul, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm also not going to save you. Like, this is ridiculous.
The consensus leans when it actually doesn't. So, 0 out of 4 so far for the pro-genocide section. Not looking good. The next person cited in the No Genocide section is Ronald Grigor Suni, a specialist in Armenian and Soviet history. He's written about the Holodomor Genocide question specifically a few times, though not in that much detail, at least compared to other scholars in this section. He mostly writes about it in relation to the Armenian Genocide, using it as a point of comparison to explain why he thinks the two events are different and shouldn't be labeled with the same term. Suni hasn't covered the topic in a ton of depth, though he has covered it about a half dozen times and done so very recently, so I think he warrants inclusion here, especially relative to some of the sources in the pro-genocide section. But it seems that the real reason that he's listed here, in line with the rest of the article, might be some subtle manipulation. He's quoted very selectively to imply that he agrees with the pro-genocide camp's version of events, and that his only disagreement is on the semantics, an attempt to lend validity to the
Your disagreement is on the semantics. You're arguing that since it was not planned from day one, that it was not engineered, that it was not a genocide at all. This is a ridiculous claim, and none of your sources have claimed this. Ridiculous. You should be ashamed
genocide narrative
for being a
by implying
Marxist-Leninist.
that even someone who thinks it's not a genocide nonetheless agrees with everything except the label. It states, Suni contrasts the intentions and motivation for the Holodomor and other Soviet mass killings with those of the Armenian genocide. He states that, although on moral grounds one form of mass killing is as reprehensible as another, for social scientists and historians, there is utility in restricting the term genocide to what might more accurately be described as ethnocide. That is, the deliberate attempt to eliminate a designated group. His definition of genocide involves both the physical and cultural extermination of a people. However, this passage is spliced together from a bunch of different quotes from one of Sunni's books, where he only actually made a fleeting mention of the Holodomor, and it tries to make it look like he was actually making a more specific claim on the matter. In reality, he was not specifically referring to the Holodomor. Rather, he listed it among a bunch of different events, and then later suggested that perhaps some events called genocides would be better called ethnicides, without referring specifically to the Holodomor. Yet the quotes are arranged in a way that makes it look like he was. This is made clearer in a book review that Sunni wrote, where he agreed that the Holodomor was not actually an ethnocide nor a genocide. So contrary to how Wikipedia makes it seem, he doesn't actually apply either label to the Holodomor. The next quote in the wiki makes his actual position more clear, though it's still very editorialized. In the full version, he says, Stalin's intentions and actions during the Ukrainian famine, no matter what sensationalist claims are made by nationalists and anti-communists, were not the extermination of the Ukrainian people, but were related perversely to the collectivization campaign, the destruction of any form of resistance to the dictates of the ruling party, and the absurdly high targets for requisitioning grain. Incompetence and callousness were as much culprits as fear of potential resistance, anger at the failure to deliver grain, and deep-seated hostility toward peasants and nationalists, like the 19th century Irish famine, the Bengal famine of 1943, and the Chinese famine of 1958 to 1961. In Ukraine, the government was culpable in the deaths of millions. It is understandable that such horrific occurrences should be thought of as genocidal in both scope and intention, given that the foreseeable consequences of state policy resulted in mass death. But since they were not directed at the extermination of a different ethnic, religious, or cultural group, a different set of explanations is required. So it's pretty clear that Sunni's opinion on the matter is much like that of the other scholars in the not genocide camp.
So basically, what Empanada is fixating on is to desperately, so what? I'm gonna be frank. What if we don't call it genocide? What if we just call it a mass murder of millions? What, does it make it better? Does it make it better in Empanada's eyes? Just calling it the mass murder of millions? Like, this is ridiculous. I'm sorry, this is ridiculous.
The famine was
Is he really thinking he's making himself look good here? By making this argument? It might have been his Baba's argument. Like, seriously, it might have been a mass murder of millions. It might have been a mass murder of millions, but at least it's not. But at least we cannot call it genocide. That is what Baba is basically saying. I'm sorry, this is like ridiculous.
Result of bad.
Like, this is ridiculous, especially since this is really desperate. Because once again, I will remind what he is basically arguing for, that it was not started from the get-go, not engineered from the get-go as a genocide. And the fact is that it was an act of genocide, yes. Because Stalin wanted to rapidly industrialize, as I said before. He wanted to do it no matter the cost. He didn't care if millions of Ukrainians would die while it happened. And he pushed for it no matter how many millions would die. So he did push for it. It did cause a famine. Millions did die. I'm sorry. And this is not even something that Empanada sources argue against. The sources that he gave agree with this presentation of the facts. Empanada's sources agree with what I just said.
and even callous policy, but was certainly not intended to kill Ukrainians, nor anyone. He's emphatic about that conclusion, yet the article makes him look quite a bit less sure.
None of his sources claim that it was an accident. They claim that it was a ridiculous policy that resulted in the millions of okay, I will rephrase this. The sources that Ben Empanada gives claim that the policy was the plan and the millions of deaths were the result of the policy that was forced, and not that the deaths were planned and that the policy done in order to kill millions. But you know what? In both cases, I would argue it's genocide. Because in one scenario, it is pushing the plan even if it allows millions to die. And in the second scenario, it is planning to kill millions and doing a plan in order to do so. In both scenarios, it's basically killing millions. But the reasons are different, yes. But it's still killing millions. Yeah, it says on the wiki itself, but I'm not gonna argue over a technicality. I'm sorry, Obscurus. If it's not a genocide, then it just becomes a mass murder of millions. Are you saying that there is a really big difference between a genocide and a mass murder of millions? Because this is basically an argument about if we are allowed to use the word genocide to label this mass murder of millions. And I will also remind you, Obscurus, I will show you the Polish. I will show you something, Obscurus, okay? Something very interesting. Some food for thought, okay? Some food for thought for you. This is the Wikipedia called the Holodomor Genocide question. This Wikipedia article asks the question, is this a genocide or not? Are you seeing something interesting? Can I point you to something interesting? What are you noticing here on the left side? Can you tell me? What are you noticing? The lack of many languages here. For example, this doesn't have a Polish equivalent because in Poland this is not disputed at all. Like, the only thing that Ben Empanada Baba is disputing is whether or not this was planned from the start. But it doesn't matter if it was planned from the start. What matters is that the USSR, through neglect and through choosing a plan that would not work, chose to let millions die, basically. That is what I claim as the genocide. Not that it was a plan from day one to kill millions of Ukrainians and that the plan to industrialize was implemented in order to do it. Do you understand? Yeah, do you understand the argument? Then Empanada is basically trying to say, since it was not engineered from the start, it wasn't a genocide. And what I'm saying is, if the USSR pushed for an impossible plan, and it was an impossible plan, pushed by a leader who had no expertise or experience, and had a history of mass murder, by the way, and knew that it would end in millions dying, and still pushed for that plan, then yes, it was a genocide. You know?
On the matter than he actually is. This has been a recurring theme so far. The opinions of certain authors are presented in misleading and contradictory ways that almost seem intentionally designed to confuse the reader as to what their position actually is, in a way that favors the pro-genocide conclusion. So far, that's 3 highly detailed recent scholarly assessments of the question in the not genocide section.
Yeah, that claim that while it was not a genocide in the sense that it was planned from the get-go, it was still allowing millions to die through neglect and pushing a plan that caused a famine.
Along with one less detailed but still adequate scholarly opinion, while the pro-genocide section has just been a complete and total mess in comparison. Let's see if the next citation changes that. This one is of
Станіслав Калчицький
and
Хен Надія Єфіменко.
according to the wiki article,
Stanislav Kulczynski, let's see.
they compiled data on all-cause mortality in Ukraine, meaning everyone who died, during the time period relevant to the famine, and compared death rates among different ethnicities in the country. Using this, they concluded that people of the
Obscurist. If you think that if it's genocide or not, I'd argue that whether or not it's considered a genocide doesn't matter. Well, if you argue then that it doesn't matter if it's considered a genocide or not, then I will tell you that most of the sources that Bad Empanada Dada has quoted do not argue that it was not a mass murder of millions. All of them have said that it was a crime against humanity. All of them said, one of them clearly said that Stalin chose USSR over millions of people's lives. Some of them said that yes, while it was a mass murder of millions, it was not targeting a specific group, so it can't be considered genocide. So, at best, quote unquote, it was a mass murder of millions of people in order to push a industrialization of a country. It does not make it any better in the slightest.
The Bulgarian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian ethnicities died disproportionately in the famine, mostly due to their rural status.
And I'm not even going to add the ridiculous claim that Bada Penada Dada made that the Kazakhs and other nationalities being killed by the USSR weakens the claim that the Ukrainians were in any way targeted.
But if they were disproportionately victims due to their rural status rather than due to their ethnicities, then that's actually an indicator that Ukrainians were not specifically targeted by the famine, rather just that rural people were more affected by it. So this source, if anything, would seem to be a
And the rural people just happen to be Ukrainians.
good supplement for an argument against the notion that the famine was engineered to target Ukrainians. Yet here it is, for some reason included in the pro-genocide section. Suffering being concentrated in the rural population is unfortunate.
That's because it wasn't engineered to target Ukrainians. The whole plan was supposed to industrialize the country, and the people, the person making the plan knew that it would affect the rural people, and those rural people just happened to be Ukrainian.
Unfortunately completely normal in a famine. Small-holding peasants are always hit first and hardest because they rely directly on the harvest for everything, to feed themselves and to make money or to get something to barter. The Indian economist Amartya Sen, a specialist in famines, explained this well. If the output from my farm falls sharply because of some local calamity, but the food supply in the market is unaffected...
Yeah, I'm sorry, but Stalin's 5-year plan is not a calamity. Even if it was disastrous and awful, Stalin's 5-year plan is not a natural calamity.
Or even increased, I, the peasant, shall still be forced towards starvation. What keeps me from hunger is not the food supply in the country or the region, or even in the local market, but my own inability to establish command over food. As a peasant, I get this directly from the food I grow. I am, of course, free to buy food in the market, but what do I buy it with? So rural people tend to be the primary victims of famine rather than city people because cities import their food stocks from many different areas and thus are less vulnerable to regional shortages. And their residents are much more likely to be wage laborers whose jobs will give them some sort of hard currency to purchase food with. In a widespread famine, cities eventually suffer too, but that comes a while later after many more rural victims have already died. So that victims of the famine in Ukraine were disproportionately from groups with higher rural populations, such as Ukrainians and Bulgarians, just doesn't really matter for the question of whether the famine was engineered to kill Ukrainians. So there's nothing weird about this. And no reason to assume that they were targeted based off ethnicity due to it. As the authors of this very paper concluded, and which the Wikipedia article itself literally says. So why is this here? Why is this paper cited in the pro-genocide section when its conclusions don't even fit with the argument? It just boggles the mind. This article has been through a frankly ridiculous amount of revisions, so I think it's fair to expect that it be pretty refined, but it seems more like the editors just hoped that the reader would never actually read any of the text, let alone check any of the sources. So another irrelevant, nonsensical inclusion in the pro-genocide section. That's 0 out of 5 now. There's only one source left to cover in the not genocide section. Mark B. Torga. Torga writes quite a bit on famines, most notably the Soviet famine in question and the 1973 Bengal famine. His work is generally concerned less with the specific famines in question and more with ideas about why and how famines happen in general, so he tends to use them as ways to argue for his wider theories. And said theories are, interesting. In 1991, a couple of years after the Soviet archives were opened, Torga looked at the new evidence and was one of the first researchers who used it to refute Conquest and Mace's idea that there was an adequate harvest during the famine and the Soviet government had withheld it intentionally to kill Ukrainians. Rather, he argued that there was actually a shortfall, like Wheatcroft and Davies did later on. On this basis, he said that the famine could not have been an intentional act of genocide. Nonetheless, he still blamed the Soviet government for it, concluding that it was caused by the failure of their forced collectivization of farming.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, they didn't do the forced collectivization, they didn't do the forced industrialization and collectivization in order to kill Ukrainians. They forcefully industrialized knowing that it would lead to it and went with it anyway. Yeah.
So, basically the same stance of the other scholars we've gone over, who've also argued that it wasn't a genocide. However, 10 years later, Torga wrote a new, longer paper on the same famine, where he pretty significantly changed this argument. He still concluded it wasn't a genocide, but now he explained this by arguing that the famine was mostly caused by environmental factors outside of anyone's control, and that this explains the grain shortfall better than the explanations of other authors, such as Wheatcroft and Davies.
Oh, I bet you like
argued
this
that
one the best,
shortfall
right?
was more of a failure
Marxist
of government
Leninist
policy. So for Torga, the government bears comparatively little responsibility for the famine. They still did things wrong, but overall, the real overwhelming tipping point was Mother Nature, not Stalin and his government's action.
And this is
to
like
understand
silly.
why Torga shifted to this conclusion, we need to understand the direction of his wider body of work that deals
I bet that Per Empanada Dada will agree with this most and will just say that this was all just caused by natural causes. It was just natural causes that, I guess Ukrainian people just needed to die.
with famines. The most popular view among famine researchers is that all famines
Sending them food was
at
also
least
impossible,
notwithstanding
right?
incredible exceptions, like if an asteroid hit the Earth or something, I guess.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
doesn't mean they're literally intentionally created. It doesn't mean they can't be exacerbated by environmental factors. Rather, it means that there is or should always be enough food, either in a region, a country, or in the world, and who has access to it is ultimately socially determined. So when a famine results in lots of deaths, it can always be explained through man-made factors. Some obvious examples would be poor distribution of existing food supplies caused by poor government policy, or a lack of ability to buy food among the poor due to market factors, or a lack of good agricultural practices to make crops more resilient to poor weather
There you go.
conditions. All of those can be attributed to humans. But there's also countless less obvious ways that famines are man-made. For example, if a government doesn't keep adequate emergency food stocks to be used in times of famine, that's a man-made
confiscates
factor.
them.
The lack of adequate food relief imports from elsewhere is also a man-made factor, whether it be due to a decision of local or international government. There's always sufficient food in the world for everyone, so if some people aren't getting enough, that's due to artificial barriers put up by human societies, thus man-made. In the case of our subject matter, based on the sources we've read before Torga, the famine was man-made in the sense that it was the result of a failure of agricultural policies, and that more people then died due to inadequate redistribution of food from other regions which had surpluses. This doesn't necessarily imply malicious intent. Man-made famines are often attributable more to problems with economic, social, and political systems, and poor decision-making than to malice. Torga basically seems to think that everything that I've just said is bullshit, and that the famines that he's written about were all mostly caused by nature, rather than any of the human factors we just went over. For another example, he's also written on the Bengal famine of 1943, in which about 3 million Indians died, arguing that it was pretty much caused by nothing more than the weather, and the British Empire literally did nothing wrong at all. Usually, denial of any British responsibility in the Bengal famine, and denial of any Soviet responsibility in the Holodomor, are things that you would expect from wildly different ideological currents. Someone would deny one or the other, not both. So Torga's stance is very unique. I went over the Bengal famine in a video on the topic, which you should check out if you're interested in knowing more. But the gist of it is that the famine was partly caused by the actions of the British Empire, and many of the deaths once it began were due to its negligence and at times maliciousness. Many deaths could have been avoided, but the Empire didn't even try to do what was necessary to save people. Torga, however, just like in his writing on the Holodomor, holds that the natural factors were overwhelmingly important, so the government of Winston Churchill did pretty much nothing wrong at all. I also directly refuted his arguments on this in my aforementioned longer video on Bengal, and I don't want to go too far off topic here, considering how long this video already is. But basically, he just seems very invested in this idea that everyone else is wrong, and famines are not actually man-made ever. He even thinks that any notion that the British Empire deserves blame for the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, which was pretty much the clearest example of callous colonial policy causing a famine that you could ever imagine, is little more than a nationalist myth. So Torgler
I
is very
guess
biased, but
when
it's harder to notice
it's written
because he's
bad
not biased
when
in the usual politically
West does it,
motivated way,
it's
rather in a
fake
sort of scholarly
when
argument
the
way.
USSR
What's
does
interesting
it.
about the
Okay.
wiki article, though, is that it totally ignores his later article on the matter, which takes a much firmer stance against ascribing blame onto anyone for the famine, and instead exclusively cites his earlier one. After seeing all the subtle bias inserted into this article, I can only assume that this is because the editors found its conclusions to be a bit softer, and thus more in line with their own bias. It
I
also
see.
includes a couple of critiques
Because
of
you don't have a
Torger's
bias.
views. Any such critiques are wholly absent from opinions cited in the pro-genocide section, yet included multiple times here in the not genocide section, probably because of that same bias. Torger's work regarding the influence of the environment on the Holodomor is valuable. His conclusions, however, go too far and are clearly crowded by his own personal crusade against the notion that humans could possibly be to blame for millions of people dying in predictable and preventable ways. So he's a serious scholar, and he definitely merits inclusion here. He's just quite heterodox, and goes a bit too far with his conclusions, to the point that even most other scholars in the no-genocide camp disagree with.
So to translate this one is good, but he also says that Britain did nothing bad, which you disagree with, so not quite good. Okay.
With them. This context
He only partially agrees with you, so basically only partially good. Got it.
surrounding his work is very important, as it's often cited by people who outright deny literally any government responsibility for both
But he is important, because he partially agrees with you. Okay.
Soviet famines of
Okay.
1932 to
I see.
33 and the Bengal famine. So that's 5
Got
out
it.
of 5 for serious, modern scholarly opinions for the not genocide section so far, versus 0 out of 5 for the pro-genocide section. And we've got 3 more to go, each of them in the pro-genocide section. The editors decided to put 8 authors in that section versus only
It's gonna be 0, right?
5 in the no genocide section, despite the fact there's plenty more out there who they're missing who they could have put there. Gee, I wonder why. Could it be for the exact same reason as every single other weird omission or manipulation in this article?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe. Since I think I've already kind of made my point with this video, it's already pretty damn obvious that the pro-genocide section is being padded with a bunch of fluff. I'm going to rush through these last 3 for the sake of just finishing this quicker.
This is
It's
very
already incredibly
manipulative and
long,
dishonest.
and I want to make it to the conclusion before we all die to some sort of climate change-induced fireball. So, without further ado, Stephen Rosefield. The wiki quotes his book Red Holocaust, which kinda gives the game away with its title. While Rosefield is a serious economist, this book is not serious. It's your typical anti-communist propaganda tract, where the author already had the idea that the Nazis and the USSR were practically the same in mind before writing, and sought to justify that post hoc. This is an incredibly problematic endeavor, as equations of the Holocaust with Stalinist repressions and killings are not only complete bullshit, but are actually part of ultranationalist and fascist myth-making in Eastern Europe. The idea is that by equating the USSR with the Nazis, the actual fascists who collaborated with the Nazis and helped to carry out the Holocaust can be rehabilitated in the modern day, normalizing some of history's most heinous criminals as mainstream national heroes. One example is Stepan Bandera in Ukraine, a Nazi collaborator who tried to cleanse the country of Jews, Poles, and Russians, who is today hailed as a hero following a decades-long government campaign to equate Nazism with communism, which culminated in a law being passed that declared both to be equivalent. Rosefield's book plays into all that perfectly. If we look at the part that Wikipedia cites for his views on the Holodomor specifically, it's actually from a footnote, and in just a couple of sentences with very little justification, it asserts that the famine deaths were the result of so-called terror starvation. Because I guess if you put terror beforehand, that makes it sound worse. He justifies using this term by stating that the grain shortfall didn't cause these deaths, rather poor distribution of available food. Therefore, it's inaccurate to call these people simple famine victims, rather than victims of calculated murder. But as we just went over, that's true for all famines. There's always enough food somewhere. It's just a question of how it's distributed. So his argument just doesn't make sense. By that measure,
What do you mean?
every famine ever should be classified as a genocide, so the Holodomor would lose any notion of having a special status. In another passage,
No, what?
Rosenfield claims that new archival evidence proves that Stalin's so-called terror starvation is indictable as a crime against humanity equal to the Holocaust. However, the footnote for this, rather than providing any proof for this extraordinary claim, that is quite opposite of what the new archival evidence actually proved, is just a bitter rant about
everything's
another scholar's Soviet
genocide and
economic
nothing is.
calculations, literally completely unrelated. Nothing about that smoking gun
No,
new
he was
archival
not.
evidence
He was
proving
not.
that the Holodomor
Stalin was not better than the Nazi, no.
was as bad as the Holocaust at all. And if that wasn't bad enough, in this book, which we're apparently meant to believe is a serious and measured academic treatment of the Holodomor, he literally cites Wikipedia 14 times. I'm not shitting you. There's multiple entire footnotes that are just links to Wikipedia articles. He couldn't even be bothered to check their sources and cite those directly. He just cites Wikipedia, straight up. He also doesn't even specify which revision of the articles that he's referring to. And this book was released 12 years ago, so they've probably changed completely since. Dear God. This is garbage. That's 0 out of 6 for the pro-genocide section.
Oh, wow.
They get extra and they still fail.
Is the pro gonna get even 1 point or no? Wow. What an even-handed...
Next up, Norman Naimark, specifically his book Stalin's Genocides, which argued for a wider definition of genocide in order to be able to define basically everything that happened during Stalin's rule of the USSR as genocide. The chapter in this book on the matter is just a rehashing of Robert Conquest's arguments, contending that, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary that has been found since, there was no poor harvest and no shortfall of grain, therefore the famine must have been an intentional genocide. This is especially egregious of an argument to make because Naimark clearly knows about Wheatcroft and Davies' work, showing that this actually wasn't the case. He cites them directly a few times, but ignores their conclusions. He also acknowledges that there is no evidence to assume that the famine deaths were carried out intentionally to kill Ukrainians, but nonetheless concludes that they were targeted anyway. It's a very short, low-effort chapter that offers nothing new and makes no attempt at all to engage with the counter-arguments that contradict these conclusions. Nonetheless, Naimark is at least considered to be a serious scholar, and this is nowhere near as egregiously bad as Rosefield's book. It's lazy and just a rehash of old, obsolete arguments, but at least it's not Wikipedia citing rant about everyone I don't like in the footnotes level. I think it's about as valid of an inclusion as Ronald Grigor Suni was in the not genocide section. So I'm gonna throw the pro-genocide camp a bone here and say that this one qualifies. It's nowhere near as good as some of the highly detailed and developed academic treatments in the other section,
what do you know?
but at least it's something.
It sucks, but it's
Score is
something,
now
yeah.
1 out of 7. They finally did it. One kind of valid source. Now, the last one. Timothy Snyder and his book, Bloodlands. Snyder is a serious historian, or at least he used to be, but this book is very questionable for similar reasons
not
to
when it comes to
Rosefield's
disagreeing with Empanada, baba.
Red Holocaust. It stretches the truth quite a bit because the author really wanted to draw an equivalence between the Nazis and the USSR, thus playing into the ultranationalist double genocide theory. One reviewer explained quite well how Snyder's book enables this. The obsession with finding some excuse for massive local participation in the Holocaust is very much alive today among the elite classes of politicians, academics, especially historians, and media people throughout Eastern Europe. The Free Baltic states in the late 1990s set up state-sponsored commissions to study Nazi and Soviet crimes, but not in an open and democratic spirit. This was a project of ultranationalist revisionism with an active political agenda that meant much more to the politicians than this or that historical volume produced for minute readerships. The political agenda was, in short, to rewrite the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust by state diktat into a model of double genocide. Holocaust denial was, in fact, never an option in a region with hundreds of mass graves. Instead, a new and more worrying Holocaust obfuscation movement took off with a lot of government support in the region. It tries to reduce all evil to equal evil, in effect to confuse the issue, in order to write the inconvenient genocide that is the Holocaust out of history as a distinct category. This is not a local
Why would the Holocaust be inconvenient for the Baltic states? What? What are you talking about?
Issue at all. It is part of a new far-right move, sweeping the new accession states in
What?
the eastern regions of the European Union. So this book is very much a polemic rather than a work of historical scholarship, meant to contribute original research to an ongoing consensus. Snyder has nothing new to say, rather he
Why would the Holocaust be inconvenient to the
just cites the
United
work of
States?
others whose research is convenient for
explain?
him, while ignoring the inconvenient research. His argument for the Holodomor being intentionally designed to kill Ukrainians is just yet another rehashing of Robert Conquest's old, obsolete conclusions that the man himself renounced almost 2 decades ago. Snyder cites many of the authors who've argued that the famine wasn't intentional, yet nonetheless, like Neymark, just ignores their conclusions. He cites the parts that he finds convenient, then argues the opposite of them without actually dealing with their competing arguments, because he just really seems to want to compare the USSR to the Nazis and make it look like no possible counter-arguments to this even exist. Nonetheless, Snyder is still a serious historian, in spite of his recent incredibly embarrassing turn to writing books for a popular audience, such as bangers about how Donald Trump was a secret Russian agent, and also literally some sort of hybrid between Stalin and Hitler. The Hitler-Stalin or something.
I'm sorry, there was no secret pact between Hitler and Stalin. They had an official pact. It is called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. You should read about it.
So Snyder's book isn't very good at covering the Holodomor, but I think his opinion still merits inclusion in the Wikipedia article for the same reason Neymark's and Sunni's do. They're just adequate enough. So, the final scorecard here. Pro-genocide section. 2 valid sources out of 7 total, both of them relatively low-quality rehashes of old arguments, but nonetheless from reputable enough scholars and written recently enough to merit inclusion. Not genocide section. Free, high-quality, original academic treatments that deal specifically with the genocide question, and 2 comparably low-quality but still valid opinions for 5 out of 5 total. I think I've proven my point here regarding the clear bias demonstrated by Wikipedia, even on such a highly refined article like this one, which was the result of more than...
You have proven how well you are with manipulation. Congratulations.
A decade of the community working together to create. I already made my arguments surrounding this at the beginning of the video, and everything since has just been proof, so I don't want to drag this on for even longer by just restating everything. That part is over with. So instead, I'm going to conclude with some insight into how the narrative regarding the famine in Ukraine being a genocide was spread, my own opinion on the Holodomor genocide question and the scholarship surrounding it, which I formed from reading the work cited here, and much more, and also a bit of a rant about the USSR and Mr. Joseph Stalin.
Okay, much more, I see. You read much more, okay. Conclusion.
The Holodomor is,
this should be interesting,
truthfully, much more of a political issue than a historical one. After
course.
such a massive disaster, it was at least inevitable that some of the victims would come to believe that the famine had been intentional. Though this says nothing about whether the famine was actually intentional or not, the mere fact that such an idea exists is hardly inorganic. But the way that it's been pushed kind of is inorganic. The historical scholarship on the matter was born as an attempt to affirm a process of nationalist and anti-Soviet myth-making rather than simple honest research. All of the original big-time scholars on the matter from the 80s, such as the aforementioned James Mace and Robert Conquest, were paid directly to do their research by right-wing Ukrainian nationalist groups abroad, who obviously had a big political vendetta against the Soviet.
Yeah, of course. Ukrainian sources are just all Nazis, right? I wonder on which side you are in the current conflict. I wonder.
Union, and still do now, even after its fall. For them, the idea that Stalin planned to and did intentionally starve millions of Ukrainians
Uncle Stalin
is very
was good,
convenient
yeah,
for
of
political purposes, and they've actually really succeeded at their goal. The understanding of the Holodomor that they've pushed is now pretty much dominant among those who actually know what it was, and it seems that no amount of research refuting that idea is going to change that, because the facts don't actually matter. The myth does. From the 2000s onwards, the Ukrainian government itself even started to aggressively push this narrative. It's invested a ton into promoting it, For example, by lobbying international organizations and other countries' governments to recognize the Holodomor as a planned genocide of Ukrainians, and by straight up paying anyone, even remotely reputable, who's willing to write things that align with that interpretation. Unfortunately, this has all been part of a wider and highly...
So everybody who is reputable and writes about the genocide is a paid shill, it's all fake, it's a white conspiracy. Okay.
Successful campaign in Ukraine to spread the aforementioned double genocide view of history and thus legitimize the ultranationalist and fascist groups who trace their lineage to Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators, and to thus primarily define themselves in opposition to the USSR and today's Russia because they imagine...
There we go. So I can see where you are on the conflict, today's conflict with Ukraine.
As, well, Asiatic hordes, which of course through some very adept...
Asiatic hordes, interesting. Consider that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was considered to be an Asiatic country. Ukraine was part of the Commonwealth. Are you really going to use this argument against Ukraine? Asiatic hordes.
Gymnastics they themselves not a part of, despite also being Slavs. For this reason, the research on the matter, which is much more nuanced than the general public perception would indicate, and which actually leans quite heavily towards the idea that there is just no evidence for any national interpretation of the famine, has largely been ignored outside of its academic bubble. This is made clearer through a comparison with the same famine's effect on Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan actually suffered worse and even longer than Ukraine did. Around 30% of its population...
Yeah, because once again, the USSR under Stalin pushed for rapid industrialization, which could not be achieved without the death of millions. The USSR pushed for it anyway. That is what happened.
Died. And just like Ukraine, there's also a myth in Kazakhstan which frames the famine as a planned genocide of Kazakhs, which is similarly rejected by most modern historical scholarship. But unlike the intentional Holodomor narrative, you've probably never heard of this idea, because there's simply no accompanying political movement spreading it internationally by paying people to write about it or make documentaries or movies about it, holding international events about it, or lobbying other governments to recognize it as such. Nor is the Kazakh government pushing the idea aggressively. My own assessment of the evidence and the research that we've gone over here is that the famine in Ukraine was not planned or carried out intentionally at all, nor were Ukrainians specifically targeted on ethnic grounds. No direct evidence for either of those assertions has ever been found, so every argument for them is based on little more than inferences and circumstantial evidence at best. And worse, these arguments were formed before the Soviet archives were opened, under the assumption that there would be some sort of special smoking gun secret document in there that proved all of them. And yet, when the archives opened and this evidence never surfaced, the arguments still remain the same, making the political motivations behind them just more obvious. The evidence indicates that the famine affected a much wider area than just Ukraine, including 2 million dead in Russia itself, so the national interpretation is just incorrect. It was caused by a failure in agricultural policy exacerbated by natural factors, which led to a poor harvest, which led to a regional food shortage, and which Stalin's government failed to adequately respond to.
So basically it was forced. It was caused by forcing a horrible policy that couldn't work and caused the death of millions. Yeah. That
large part because they wanted to hide the famine from the wider USSR and world, hence they undertook most of their relief efforts in secret, which obviously greatly hindered their effectiveness. So they certainly deserve a lot of the blame, but they didn't kill anyone intentionally. The famine was undesired. This means that the famine clearly doesn't meet the common definition of the term genocide, which most people think to involve mass intentional killing of specific groups of people,
so they allowed for the deaths of millions, simply. Okay, I feel so much better now.
than many accidental deaths among different groups of people. Under a wider definition of genocide, might qualify.
It was not accidental. It was not accidental because the plan was pushed on purpose.
That would need to be a definition that includes deaths by mismanagement and neglect, and that doesn't need to be targeted at any specific group of people, which just really kind of defeats the point of the term and would implicate basically every government in the world of genocide. So by the understanding of the vast majority of people and the UN definition of the term, the Holodomor was not genocide. That said, it was still mostly the fault of Stalin's government. Stalin's agricultural policy was disastrous, and his treatment of the peasants was incredibly brutal. To him, they were closer to serfs than comrades in a socialist project. Peasant disobedience to this state of affairs was inevitable and caused by the government itself. And their reaction to that, rather than listening to peasant grievances and changing course, was to brand any dissenter as a kulak, a saboteur, a class enemy. Their narrative was quite literally that the peasants were basically intentionally starving themselves to death to get back at the government, which is obviously just absurd. Some Stalinists today still cling to this same excuse for the famine, framing it not just as an important factor, but the most important factor. But there is quite literally not one single serious historian who would agree with that. It's complete nonsense. Even if the famine was not a genocide, it was still a massive failure of policy, and the government reacted with more concern for its self-image than for the people who were dying en masse. This is not at all something unique to Stalin or the USSR. Governments in general love to cover up and downplay events that are inconvenient for them. But it
was nothing unique to Stalin. It happened everywhere. Millions of people died everywhere at the time. Yeah, sure.
Nonetheless, and it's impossible for such a massive human disaster not to be attributable to the authorities who oversaw it, and especially not the ultimate authority. In this case, Stalin. The fact of the matter is that Stalin heavily deviated from principles formed by Lenin and earlier Bolsheviks regarding the autonomy of peasants and of nationalities, with disastrous effect, demonstrated by this famine along with many other things, such as Lysenkoism, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, and the reversal of Lenin's cultural and language policies, which were designed to foster each Soviet republic's unique identity. Compared to other Soviet leaders, Stalin was uniquely brutal in ways which were not just completely unnecessary for the economic and social development of the USSR, but also just actively detrimental to it. So under no circumstances can his crimes be justified as simply being for the greater good. Stalin was also just not really anything exceptional in global terms either. His crimes, while real, are very heavily exaggerated. In reality, they were similar to what many Western capitalist leaders have done. The vast majority of those who hyper-focus on Stalin and the USSR have never reckoned with the similar, and honestly mostly worse, crimes of their own countries or of those they support, or even outright deny them. That Stalin is singled out as being uniquely bad is just a propaganda artifact.
Nothing? No? What? Nobody's singling out saying he's uniquely bad. What do you mean? This is what this... It's like... it's as if I would say, oh, people say how Hitler was uniquely bad, but there were many leaders as horrible as him. What does that have to do with anything?
Sad reality is that he was engaging in the same nation-building practices that other European countries had perfected beforehand.
But guess what? The same could be said about Hitler. So?
But that's exactly why he sucked. The USSR was meant to be better than that. It was meant to offer and represent something that was different to the oppression that had characterized the past. That Stalin's government went and did much of the same anyway is just sad. Some people on the left have problems reconciling this and overcompensate by denying Stalin's crimes or even justifying them. But you don't need to.
Oh, do you mean like you did in this video?
They had nothing to do with the economic and political systems of the USSR, and everything to do with he and his government's paranoid attempts to maintain their own power. A USSR
start yourself, no big deal.
Without the ethnic deportations and without the terrible agricultural policy absolutely could have existed, and it would have been a much better one, because none of those things were core to its functioning. And while we're at it, it still would have beaten back the Nazis too. Note that I'm referring only to Stalin here. Other Soviet leaders also did things that I don't agree with too, but nothing even remotely on the scale and brutality and needlessness as Stalin did. Everything was significantly better for the few decades after he was gone, and some other socialist movements clearly learned from his problems and avoided them. Just look at the treatment of peasants during and after the Cuban Revolution, for example, compared to what Stalin did to them. It's really night and day. Working with them as partners in building something better versus just treating them as tools to be used.
No, he's saying Stalin might be bad, but he's nothing special. He's just one of the many people that were just as bad as him in the West. This is what he is saying. So basically he's saying, yeah, he was bad, but not really that bad. This is what he is basically saying. If you translate it through all the fluff that he's saying. Yeah, Stalin was maybe bad, but basically everyone was doing the same thing, so, you know, he might have been super bad for the USSR, but on the world scale, he was basically just one of many leaders who were basically identical to him. That's what he said, basically.
As a means to an end. The USSR and the revolutions that it inspired,
Which is a thing that basically could be made, which is an argument that could be made about every single bad leader in history. You could say that about Hitler.
elsewhere were certainly not perfect, nor would I personally even frame them as being achievements or anything especially amazing, but they certainly had the right goals in mind, and all that it takes is a little bit of a glance beyond the propaganda to see that these countries managed to eclipse, or still do eclipse, the living standards of people in liberal capitalist countries at similar levels of development. And what really matters to me is not making the economic numbers go up for the sake of it, it's making sure that as many people as possible live as equally well as possible. We can learn from
Okay.
the good while still denouncing the bad and making sure not to repeat it. The Soviet famine of 1932 to 33 was a massive failure on the part of the government. It should not have happened, and millions of the resulting deaths could have been avoided with a much more urgent, adequate, and open response. Still not the genocide that it's often taken for granted as being, though, and definitely not a famine that was planned and engineered to genocide Ukrainians. So, we've gone in depth.
Yeah, because most serious scholars do not argue that was engineered from the start in order to genocide Ukrainians. But most serious scholars, including the ones you have cited, do argue that the plan was pushed no matter what and that the Ukrainians were allowed to starve.
On just how and why Wikipedia is biased with a very thorough example. We've also gone over a big part of the academic scholarship surrounding the Holodomor and the question of whether or not it was a genocide, and I even managed to fit in a rant about Stalin and the USSR at the end. Yay.
Hooray.
This was way longer than what I thought it would be when I started writing. Dear God. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel, check out my other videos, and consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon and Ko-fi so that I can make more stuff like this. It all really helps. Without my supporters, I would not be able to make this sort of thing. And you get some benefits for supporting me too. Like your name in the credits, access to my Discord, access to exclusive previews of my videos, and a monthly update and Q&A video where you can ask me questions. I'm just one person making this all by myself. I do literally everything with no help from anyone, from the research to the writing to the filming to the editing. It's all just me. It's the same for all of my videos. So if you want to support me in any way, shape or form, be it subscribing or spreading my videos around or supporting me monetarily, it's greatly appreciated. So yeah, now I'm going to roll the credits where I thank my supporters.
Okay, good. Let's look at the comments. Plus, for someone that says that it's all... No, this was not a good video. This was a very dishonest video, I'm sorry. Just because it was not planned from zero to be a genocide, it does not mean that it was not one.